What is your best one time my dad story? One time my dad took me to my college orientation back in '98. I grew up in an urban setting and wanted to mix it up, so I decided on an undergrad school in a very rural area. Read, not a lot of diversity. My dad is the best and always wants to goof around. We had this Jeep growing up that we called Little Blackie because it was little and black. A running joke was that anytime any of us in the family saw a similar looking Jeep, one of us would yell, "Hey, look, it's Little Blackie." Bet you see where this is going. We are walking around campus and sure enough, there was a Jeep parked within sight. My dad starts yelling, "Hey, look, Little Blackie, Little Blackie." Of course the only African American kid on campus was walking right in front of us. My dad was oblivious and kept right on yelling. The poor kid looked at me in disgust and I was so very mortified. I wanted to disappear. I ended up becoming really good friends with him later in my freshman year, and after I explained the whole story he laughed super hard. Thank goodness. I still cringe thinking about it though. One time my dad defended my honor in the form of a snowball fight / massacre, which I didn't learn about until nearly a decade later. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old walking home from my friend's house after enjoying a snow day sledding around in her hilly backyard. Apparently the neighborhood boys around my age, I'm girl, spent their day building a fort structure. I remember stopping briefly to admire it, but no kids in sight. Oh well, I turn and continue walking home. Suddenly about 5 boys popped out the back of the fort and pummel the shit out of me with snowballs. I guess they also spent the day stocking ammunition and awaiting the perfect passing victim. They really faked my shit up. I'm a stupidly petite adult and thusly was a really tiny little girl, and these dumb boys really didn't understand that they were going too far. I was down on the ground and still getting mailed snowball after snowball, mostly in the head/face area. After the initial shock, I made efforts to block the shots with my snow saucer and finally got on my feet to run. They followed me until they ran out of projectiles and retreated. Relieved, I stopped running and was just so upset. I was barely even walking, just dragging my feet, crying, trying to wipe my face with big stupid bulky gloves. Then my dad's car pulls up next to me. He had gone to work that day, despite the snow, and had just pulled into the neighborhood. "Hey kid, need a ride?" So yeah, I get in the car, and he sees I've been crying. At first I wouldn't tell him why I was upset, because I was embarrassed and didn't want to be a tattletale. Once we pulled into the driveway though, he wouldn't let me out of the car until I told him what was up. After my explanation he told me to go inside and get washed up for dinner, that he'll be inside in a few minutes. Okay, so time warp to 10 years later. I was planning a big high school graduation cookout at our house, and I was inviting all the kids from the neighborhood. A couple of those boys from the snowball incident told me they didn't really feel comfortable hanging out at my parents' house, to which I'm like, "Da fuck are you talking about?" These boys then lay out this tale. On that fateful snow day, my dad drove back to the kids' fort and screamed at all of them to come out or he would call their parents. Once all the boys were lined up, Dad, still in his suit and tie, demolished their fort, kicked the sheet all down. Then from the rubble he made big as man-sized snowballs and made sure each kid got a violent face full of their precious fort. Fuck yeah, Dad. I'm glad I had an opportunity to tell this story right at this moment. My dad is in the hospital tonight after a super terrifying heart issue / fainting episode this morning, and we are just waiting for more information and trying not to lose my mind. Edit. Thanks for all the love. My dad is still in the hospital for observation. They put a 3rd stent in his ticker and are talking about a pacemaker. He's in decent spirits. Thanks for my first gold. Makes me feel like a dickhead though. Also, to those who think he abused his authority as an adult, beat up little kids, and should have been arrested, the lesson to the preteen boys was how faked up it is to gang up 5-1 on someone smaller and weaker than you. One grown man versus 5 sheetheads was about equal to 5 sheetheads vs 1 little girl. No one was hurt, it was just snow. Calm your tigs. One time my dad scared the piss out of a guy that wouldn't take no for an answer. I got pretty much peer pressured onto going on a double date with a guy I hated, and I had told him I hated him. We both worked at the local fast food joint. I was fresh out of high school and naive, and felt like I had to be nice. He asked me out in a way that put me on the spot too. On his day off in the middle of my shift he showed up dressed like he was going to a wedding, brought me a bunch of flowers, and asked me in the middle of a lunch rush, mortifying me, and everyone started chanting say yes. I agreed and ran out on my shift crying and feeling like I couldn't back out. It was painfully obvious during and after the date I was not interested. He kept calling me, texting me, leaving me threatening and weird voicemails. He even drove by my house a few times. My parents, noticing my change in mood, asked me what was up, and I told them, and played them the voicemails my dad asked me. When we next had the same shift I told him my dad came to the restaurant after his factory shift. My dad is a big dude and looks scary, especially covered in grease, and wearing a uniform. My dad busts into the restaurant, gives me a hug, asks me where is the son of the beach, everyone is frozen in place, and slack-jawed. Anyone that knew my dad knew him as a goofy kind guy, so they were just in awe of this whirlwind that had bust in the door. I pointed to the kitchen and this dopey motherfucker looks like he is going to piss his pants. My dad points right at him and says, leave my daughter the fuck alone or I will go back to jail. Tells me he loves me and mom is cooking dinner. Waves to some of my friends he knows, and walks out the door like nothing ever happens. That guy went on break and never came back, and he never bothered me again. Edit: I wanted to clarify I had asked him to stop and to leave me alone several times. I told him I wanted to have a strictly polite co-worker interactions and to respect my boundaries and personal space. I even talked to the restaurant manager, and I was told to give the guy a chance and to not be so stuck up. He didn't listen, and that is when my dad got involved, and only after him, and my mom noticed my change in behavior and mood, and asked what was wrong. Edit 2. This guy tried to add me on Facebook a few years ago. He seems to have turned out to be an alright guy and is married. I hope he took this lesson to heart and learned to respect others' boundaries. I didn't add him strictly because my Facebook is limited to family and close friends that live in separate states and countries from me. One time my dad what story hasn't been told. Cut off his fingertip. He was a safety/quality guy of all things in his professional life. However, when not working he liked to drink hard. It was the weekend, so he was pounding back beers while building something like a fence or deck or maybe a faking airplane. The dude was handyman/mechanic extraordinaire, so he was cutting wood in the garage for the coffin he was building. He had one of those spinning saws. I don't know what they are called. He realized I was too much of bossy to ever make anything myself, so he didn't waste his breath telling me what the tools were called. He just kept his focus on the rocking chair he was building. Anyways, he's wrecked. He's cutting a 2x4 for the doghouse roof and not completely paying attention. I was sitting on the porch actually playing my Gamma Boy. I could hear the saw and him building his replica train station, but he told me to stay out of the garage cause it could be dangerous. Good call. So I'm sitting there, and I don't hear screaming, like you'd expect, when a dude building a loft isn't looking, and cuts off the tip of his finger. Instead I just heard the whirring of the saw, and then a weird noise which it turns out was his bone being cut. Then the saw shuts off, and what I hear is this very matter of fact, well that's just what I faking need on my day off, and I was nearly done building that dock. Then he walks out of the garage and sees me, and he's holding the tip of his finger in the hand he just cut it off of between the thumb and pinky, and his middle finger is held up, and he's holding his other hand over the top of it, and pressing down, like he's calling a timeout. He looks me in the eyes and says, "Can you get the door for me?" Then grab me some ice to put my bloody fingertip in. And sorry about the swearing, this hurts. I ran to the door, and ran and got him ice. Meanwhile he grabbed his wallet and keys, and when he came and found me in the kitchen he's got his mangled hand pressed into his hip, like he's striking some supermodel pose, and he's just shaking his head, visibly annoyed. Then I held the bag of ice open, he dropped the fingertip in it, then asked me to seal the bag. I did and gave it to him. He put it in his pocket. Then he looks at me like he's working out the best next action and finally says, "Alright, don't tell your mom about this. She'll just freak out for nothing. I'm gonna go to the hospital and get this stupid thing sewed back on. If I'm not home by dinner just tell your mom I went to the hardware store." Oh, and don't go in the garage. It looks like a horror movie in there. Then he faking drove himself to the hospital, and sure enough from that day forward his middle finger was shorter than the other fingers beside it. But I still am not 100% sure my mom knows. Edit. In case anyone reads this, or is even still in this thread, thought you might like to know that I found out what he was actually building. My stepmom owns a couple of hot dog stands that are located in home depots. Every summer she caters an outdoor movie night event for the community of her cousin. It's an all-day event, and when I was in college they asked me to help out and gave me the money they got paid so I could have some money for school. The morning of the event, I got to my dad's house and started helping him load the hot dog cart onto the back of his truck. All of a sudden this SUV starts speeding down the alley. My dad narrowly avoids getting hit, but as a SUV passes it took out the driver's side mirror of my dad's truck. The SUV then stops a few houses down, and the guy jumps out and runs into a house. My dad and I both look at each other, really confused, and then went to check out the damage. The mirror was hanging off, so we had to start figuring a way to tape it on because we needed it to make the hour-and-a-half long drive to the event. After a few minutes the guy from the SUV comes back out and walks towards us. My dad was pretty pissed and looked ready to confront him. The guy stops right in front of the mirror, looks at it, turns to us and says, "I'm so sorry. I was about to shit myself." I could barely withhold my laughter, and although my dad was still visibly pissed, I could tell he thought it was funny too. The guy ended up paying for the mirror, but the whole thing was such a weird interaction. One time my dad was riding his bike on a 3-foot tall brick wall, slipped off, hit his head on it, and got knocked out behind it for an hour or so. My grandma almost called the cops to file him missing. He also tried to see how far he could piss into a urinal, about 10 feet, before he got caught by a teacher walking into the bathroom. He also dared his best friend to throw a full milk carton at a teacher. His friend did it. That teacher was also my grandma's best friend at the time. Him and my uncle were throwing snowballs at cars passing on the highway. They hit an undercover detective. They ran back to the house and while my aunt didn't know they snuck back in, and she had to talk to the detective. He also stole my aunt's VW Beetle and took it for a midnight joyride. They got it stuck in a ditch and had a farmer pull it out with a tractor. She just found out last year, nearly 40 years later. He really likes car horns. When we were kids he held down the horn on a country road until the horn gave out and was just squeaking trying to make noise. He recently got a new aerating trailer for his lawn mower, and he was so excited about it that he did 3 of our neighbors' yards for fun. He also got himself a Christmas present a few years back and yelled "yes thank you" when he opened it. That same Christmas my mom got him a new coffee maker, and he spent the entire night setting it up and making everyone coffee. He bought a motorcycle as a midlife crisis thing. He kept it a secret from my grandma for 3 years. A 50-year-old man hiding things from his mom. My older brother fired an arrow almost straight up in the air. It came back down right on the peak of our shed, sticking straight up and dead center. You could tell he was trying not to laugh while scolding us. We were having a bonfire one night, and one of my brother's friends put a Mountain Dew can near the fire, so it heated up slowly. When it exploded it sounded like a mortar went off. It sent embers 40 feet into the air and 25 feet around. After gaining our sense we could see our dad's silhouette sprinting inside the house, because he thought we were getting shot at. I've never seen him move that fast. To clarify, he was already in the house. Edit, some more stories, and fixed some errors. Me doesn't allow the good fireworks, but Indiana does. So every June my dad would drive across the border and pick up a trunk full. One rather inebriated 4th of July, he reaches in the back, pulls out what appears to be an oversized confetti popper, and aims it at the tree before pulling the trigger. It was not a party popper. It was his emergency flare. It got stuck towards the top of the tree and turned the whole neighborhood orange. The cops in my hometown wouldn't really turn out for reports of the good fireworks unless someone lit a car on fire or something. But they will definitely turn out en masse for an emergency flare. Dad went from drunk to drill sergeant in about 2 seconds. Somehow, we managed to shove the entire stock of the good fireworks into the garage and use snow shovels to push the husks of the used ones into the parking lot across the street. When the 3 police cars and the fire/rescue truck showed up, us kids were playing with sparklers and Dad was standing with his hands on his hips, scowling at the tree. Why yes, officer, some punks were across the street, lighting off Roman candles and huge fountains, and they ran when one of their tricks got stuck in the tree. He was just about to call when they ran off. Don't they know that Roman candles are dangerous? They colder hit one of the kids. One time, when my dad was in college, he almost caused a biohazard shutdown across campus. In central Arkansas, he was able to hunt a ton of squirrels. He did so, and out the frozen bodies in his dorm freezer, so that he could have a large cooking party once he was done. A few days after the freezer got full, he went home as part of Thanksgiving vacation. Little did he know, the school shuts power off in the dorms when the students leave. So what happens to 20 squirrel carcasses after they defrost and stew in their own decaying muck? When he got back, he noticed a smell outside of his dorm. It was so foul he could taste it. In a moment of instant clarity, he knew why. Very few people were there yet, and he was one of the first to return. As he climbed up the steps to his 3rd-story room, the smell got so bad he had to stop and puke twice. Once on his floor, he ran to get to his room, so that he couldn't stop and think about what he was doing. His actual room had a literal gas cloud of rotten death. Working on instinct more than thought, my dad ran in and grabbed the squirrel carcass/mush bag from his freezer. He opened his 3rd-story window and chucked it out onto the sidewalk. With people out, my dad could see the bag tumble down through the air and split immediately on impact. There was a crowd of people, including the local firefighters, to see what was causing the mess. Luckily his bag went wide by about 20 feet, but as soon as it burst people ran. At the dean's office, my father was asked, "College ain't the right fit for you, is it, son?" Dad agreed and left that college without any kind of backlash, then finished his degree elsewhere. My dad worked at a jail near downtown. He loved it. To quote my old man, "If I won the lottery I'd work there for free." Here's a very tall muscular man that just left the neo-Nazi party. So this man is pretty much summed up as a guy who looks like he should be behind the bars as opposed to closest the bars. He is ecstatic, like a child in a candy shop in regards to prisons and jails. Well, the night was 1 AM. He did the night shift. I hear the garage open and close, and I can hear him running up the stairs and worried. Did somebody die? He lunges at my door, and with a loud creak the man's face I wish I could have saw mustered up a very loud cheer. Guess what I saw at work? I saw 2 guys faking an A-bunk. And like a shooting star, the door slams, light go off, and the house is silent. What that moment my dad and I shared is nestled in my mind. I could get an award. I could get married. I could have a very large loving my family of my own within my life. But that moment, that one moment just got crammed into my top 10 memories. And on my deathbed, I will think about that night and I will ponder what the fuck compelled my father to wake his 13-year-old son at 1 AM. To tell him that Father's Day is around the corner. I might get that man a card to relive the anniversary of that moment. Happy Father's Day, Dad. TLDR, one time my dad woke me up to tell me about an apparent life-altering sight at 1 AM. I know this probably won't be seen, however still a great story. My parents have been divorced since I was 2. Even though I still saw my mom on weekends, I grew up as a daddy's girl. My dad was always the one to really take care of me, spoil me, etc. Anyway, when I was younger, I had always wanted to go to Disney World, but it was always too expensive. Finally at 13, my dad decided since my grandpa, badass, in a motorcycle club grandpa, moved to Florida, we could go visit him and go to Disney World. My dad has always been a little Danny Tanner-ish and wore a fanny pack since I was 13, and it was just him and I was a little embarrassed. One of the days we decided to just go to the ocean with my great aunt. My aunt and I started feeding the seagulls and my dad was just chilling in one of those low to the ground beach chairs with his fanny pack next to it. All of a sudden, the tide comes up and sweeps up my dad's fanny pack. My aunt and I are still feeding seagulls, and then out of nowhere on a packed beach, my dad starts yelling my purse, and starts running and falling into the ocean. My aunt and I just started dying laughing. My dad did retrieve his purse, and he told us not to say anything to grandpa. As soon as I got back to grandpa's house I said, "Oh my god grandpa, guess what dad just did?" TLDR, the ocean ate my dad's fanny pack and my dad started screaming for his purse on a crowded beach. One time my dad told a priest that there was a special place in hell for him. He then baptized me in our kitchen sink. Okay, so I was newly born. If you read the other post I have on this thread, you know that mom and dad have already had one hell of a time the last few weeks. My father is Catholic and wanted me baptized at his church. Mom gave no facts what or where I was baptized. Just a note they weren't married. Okay, so my father headed down to his church. This had been his church since his birth. Actually, my family on his side built the faker 200 years ago, so it's the entire family's church. The priest from his childhood had recently retired, but he didn't think there'd be a problem. New priest was a dick. He literally told my father that he refused to baptize me because there was no point given that, as a bastard child, I was going to hell no matter what. So dad did the reasonable thing and told the priest to fuck off. There is a special place in hell for people who try to keep children from God. Was a part of this tirade. And he hatched a plan. Now, this man was faking devout altar boy until he was 17 sheet. He reread the Bible, at least the books, that he thought the thing he was looking for was his. And then he found it. So, technically, Christian rule says that any baptized person can baptize another. You do not have to be a priest / pastor / whatever. So, that's exactly what he did. My father baptized me. He made holy water out of tap water and did it in the kitchen sink while mom was getting my sisters from school. She came home and he told her that the baptism thing was solved. She asked if Sacred Heart, another church, had agreed to do it, and so he explained that he didn't ask and showed her the passage and then told her that he had already baptized me. I miss him. My old man used to paraglide, amongst other adrenaline-fueled things. One weekend my mum had taken me and my sister away to my grand's for the weekend. I was about 11. Dad goes paragliding from the hill near our house, but as he is coming in to land the canopy folds in on itself, and he plummeted 30 meters to the ground and lands in a field. He faked up and knew it. He is in pain, but gets himself up, walks the 20 minutes home, carrying the whole paraglider in a backpack, gets a lift from a neighbor to get his car from the top of the hill, then drives himself 30 minutes to hospital. Doctors there assess him and send him home with painkillers. He gets home and is a lot of pain. He calls my mum, who is a senior nurse at that hospital. She tells him to lie very faking still and not move till she gets there. 2 hours later we get home and she takes him back to hospital and screams blue murder at the doctors for not x-raying him. Turns out he had two crushed vertebrae and could have been paralyzed. He spent 6 months in a cast at home that we nicknamed his turtle shell and never flew again. We could have sued the hospital but didn't. He also built a customized bobsled to run on the railway of a mountain so he could get down quicker, spent 15 years renovating our home by himself and made it incredible, climbed Kilimanjaro, walked across the Pyrenees, crossed the Alps on a ski mountaineering tour, crossed the world in the merchant navy, and taught me that I could do anything I set my mind to. He died 10 years ago this June. Passed away in his own bed, surrounded by his family after a brief and excruciating cancer battle. The second he died there was the biggest thunderclap I have ever heard, directly over the house. Symbolism at its finest. Love you Dad. Sharing this just for the feels of writing it. One of my brother's cars got towed. My dad went with us to the tower to pick it up. As per usual the guy behind the counter treated us like shit, so when he turned around to get our paperwork, my dad took the cash he was using to release our car, stuck it down his pants, and wiped his balls. He then handed it to the douche behind the counter when he turned around. We live in Houston, Texas. It gets pretty sweaty down there. Another time, a neighbor gave me trouble for speeding in our neighborhood. She thought the limit was 20 when it was 30. She would jump in the road waving her arms and then yell at me because her kids play in the streets sometimes, but of course this rarely happened. I told my dad and he told me to take a picture of the speed limit sign and show her. So I did, and I explained that the limit was 30. Well, she didn't take too kindly to logic and reasoning. So, at the neighborhood association she singled out my family as speeders and petitioned to have the speed limit reduced and hire a rental cop to patrol. Some months later the cops she hired pulled her over for speeding in our very own neighborhood. I pulled over long enough to take a picture of her giving me the finger. Then the cop told me to leave. My dad made a Christmas card out of the picture and mailed it to everyone in our neighborhood. I like my dad. He takes no prisoners. Posted this before. Apologies for length, but if you care to read it, I'm confident it will be one of the more unique answers. So my dad is an intellectual type. He attends a public lectures on philosophy and science in his free time. He was attending one on theories of consciousness that had a Q+A session. The speaker was a mind functionalist. The TLDR explanation is he subscribes to the idea that the mind is a description of function. Humans can do X, Y and Z things, therefore they have minds. Consequently if a machine/alien/whatever can do basically the same stuff us, they therefore have a mind. My dad raised a common criticism which runs like this: a large group of beings, human or otherwise, could function together similar to a single person. But it sounds odd to say they therefore all have a shared mind. He used an example of ants operating in a hive intelligently. By functionalism we might conclude the hive itself has a mind. Dad meant this as a criticism, but I guess that wasn't clear. After the talk was over a guy comes over to dad. He's super excited and complimentary. Even though dad only spoke for a few minutes, this guy seems overly inspired by him. He keeps saying stuff about how your ant analogy was so insightful. I can tell you're a real intellectual. He asks if dad attended Oxford or Cambridge University, and dad says yes, Oxford. He is smug. I could tell. Then it gets weirder. The guy makes strange veiled comments, as if he's trying to tease something out of dad without asking outright. I never thought I'd meet someone like you. I know you're not like other people. It's okay. I know you can't talk about it here. This guy's also handing out some kind of shoddy looking pamphlet about his church to anyone who is interested. Dad takes one, but doesn't read it until he got home that night. And that's when it became clear. It is obvious from early on that this is not a mainstream church, but some kind of weird space cult. There is a central belief that all life, plant/bacteria etc., has the capacity to become conscious. However, those that were made so by a super advanced race of aliens. At some time in the distant past they descended and made humans and some animals conscious. Their ultimate goal is to make all life in the universe consciousness. But if they do this now, in our violent state, it would be a disaster. We already inflict so much suffering as it is that, if all plants and insects could suffer too, it would be horrific. First, we need to become enlightened and empathetic before the aliens will extend consciousness on our world. So how to achieve this? Well, the benevolent aliens cannot force us to be peaceful against our will, as this is against their nature. They can however attempt to influence our cultures in a peaceful direction through dialogue. The aliens know they cannot appear in their true form because this could cause more war. So instead, they disguise themselves as humans on Earth. Wishing to be influential and possessing superior intellect, they easily find places in our best universities, like Oxford and Cambridge. Once they attain degrees/positions, and knowing that they will be respected and listened to, they then travel the globe spreading a single message, that all forms of life, from human to lowly ant, have the capacity to be conscious. TLDR, my dad made a single comment at a philosophy lecture, and convinced someone he was a shifting benevolent alien. Edit, shifting, not cheating, laugh out loud. One time my dad quacked at a doctor. My mother's doctor. Her obgyn. She was pregnant with me. So, they had a really good doctor, but he switched clinics when she was at the beginning of her 3rd trimester, and his new clinic didn't want my mother to switch when she was that late. I don't know why. So she was reassigned to another doctor. Let's call him Dr. Quack. So things were going pretty decently. The guy was a bit of an idiot, but not enough to ask for a change. And then, the last couple weeks of pregnancy, mom had an appointment. Dr. Quack did all the things, I don't know all the details, and said that I had shrunk. According to him, this meant that I was most likely dead. Yep. So mom got an appointment at a hospital for the next day and was super duper stressed. I mean, she was just told that her baby is probably dead during her last couple months of pregnancy. She got to the appointment. They did all the things and were super confused. I was an incredibly healthy baby, way more than they had expected, what with it being an emergency. They told her that I had dropped and was due literally any day. And so, with my dad in tow, they went back to the clinic. Dad caught the Dr. Quack in the waiting room and asked for an explanation. The reply was, oh, she must have popped back. Dad kinda went ballistic. Mom almost went into early labor because this guy got a crucial detail wrong and then is defending his actions. Eventually, Dad started quaking at the guy. Mom said that a few choice sentences included was I wouldn't take my faking dog to see you, and I'm not fond of the dog, and did you get your medical license from a cereal box? Along with making sure every woman in the lobby was aware of his incompetence. The police had to come to ask him to leave. He left peacefully when they asked. I was born about a week later, just before Mother's Day. One time, my dad saved Christmas. Or at least kept one kid believing. My dad was born and buried in Italy and moved here when he was 7 in the late 1960s. He was average height, stocky, plus a bit of softness, but was a total ham and loved kids. We were living in a tiny town called Romeo in Michigan, literally a historic village with, at the time, I think fewer than 3,000 people. There wasn't exactly a town center, but my mom's mom had a couple businesses downtown, so when he dressed up to be Santa, with his little chocolate donuts physique, SNL reference, and his energetic, silly demeanor, he attracted a crowd and became unofficially official. Anyway, one of Grandma's two businesses was an antique shop. Being a lightly touristy town, southeast Michigan, and an antique shop, other Italian people and their families would spawn from time to time. To be clear, my dad didn't not look Italian, but when speaking had zero accent, save for a little bit of Midwest kick. So this woman comes by with her little kid, and like my own mom, she's tall and blonde, and has a half Italian son. Unlike my mom though, her kid really looks Italian, and speaks the language fluently. The kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, isn't too old to flip out when he sees Santa Dad and runs up to him, and, I was told, tells him about all the stuff he wants for Christmas. His mom calls out to him and says, in English, AWW, sweetie, I'm sorry. Santa can't understand you. My dad pulls the kid in, leans down, and like he's whispering, but loud enough for everyone to hear, says in Italian, actually, I speak all the languages of the world. The look on the kid's face would make you think his mind was still blown to this day. Edit, me bad at language. One time my dad almost got stuck in a car wash. We had just finished a day of skiing with our neighbors, and my dad decided that the car was just too dirty to go home with. We pull up to one of those single car washes, the ones where you put in a couple quarters and go in one door closes, then you go out the other door after. After he puts in his 8 quarters, he pulls into the car wash. Nothing happens. Confused, he pulls out, then drives back in again. Nothing. He continues this a few times, getting more and more frustrated as he had already paid the money for it. This was $2 on the line here. Well, eventually he just says fuck it and walks in. There was a door on the inside, and he was trying to see what was up. Well, that happened to be a good time for the entire car wash to start. From the car it looked like everything was happening in slow motion. He got this massive look of panic and to a head first dive for the door. He did manage to make it out in time, but not without taking a face full of snow. At this point he is pretty pissed. He has yet to get his car washed, while almost getting a wash for himself. He gets in the car and all of us are trying not to laugh as he is clearly not amused by any of this. When he pulls up to the front, where the manager is, he gets out of the car and screams at the top of his lungs, I just had a terrible car washing experience. At which point we all burst out laughing. TLDR, Dad cheaped out and almost got his own personal car wash. One time my dad took our family for a scenic vacation in a cabin by a lake somewhere in Wisconsin. I was all of 6 or 7. That week was filled to brim with mishaps and gave us many stories that we still talk about today. The one that shines above the rest was the bobber. It turns out that if you let children set up their own fishing tackle, the bobbers are not likely to remain attached to the line. Well, the fateful moment arrived when we had lost the last one. Like a castaway on the sea, our bobber was slowly heading out across the lake. My dad, proficient in rowing a small boat from his years in the Coast Guard, put down his beer, reluctantly pushed our boat into the water, and climbed aboard. "Daddy, let me come with you." "No, I'll just be a moment." Damn thing's right there, and it was, but out of reach from the dock. So he rows over to the bobber and sort of lies down in the boat to distribute his weight, then reaches, backhand, over the side of the bow to fish the bobber out. You could say what happened next was forecast by his forgetting to bring sensible camping shoes. The only shoes he had with him were the ones he'd worn home from work, an expensive pair of leather dress shoes. Well, next thing you know, those shoes were flying through the air, with his feet still in them, as the boat capsized and went for a little swim. I was laughing so hard, I nearly fell off the dock. He did bring that bobber back in though, even showed me how to properly tie it on. One time my dad cheated me out of getting a free goddamn computer. I must have been around 11 or 12ish. One of his friends wanted to give one away, I assume, to someone who might need it, don't really know why, and as my dad saw it, he himself didn't want nor need it, so he just said nah, not thinking about if any of his kids might want it. And I didn't have a computer from before. Nobody in our household had. When I heard him tell me about that offer, and that he had turned it down, it just left me speechless. I was a little pissed, though, obviously. But looking back, it wasn't all that bad. It was the 90s, for fact's sake, so it would have been a 90s computer. But still, would have been worth it, just for the sheer cool factor of being one of the few kids in class who had a computer at home, and I might have learned some cool computer things earlier. But I'll never know. But while my dad was many things, he also didn't take any shit from anyone, no matter their status, and he didn't hold back if it meant sticking his neck out for anyone else either, be it someone he knew or didn't know personally. Such as this other time, when I was also a young kid, when I went with him to some crappy cafe or something, and after a while we saw these biker guys in a corner, verbally and physically, pushing around what I can only remember being some feeble drunk-ish, dirty-looking guy, who we had never seen before, and my dad pretty much snapped. Went over to them, and basically ripped them all a new one for treating that dirty drunk guy the way they did. But it's not as if those biker looking dudes got really scared or something, but they all seemed very surprised about the fact that some random guy would stick his neck out for some apparent drunk loser and tell them to show this man some damn respect, for God's sake. He might be drunk, but he's still a goddamn human being, which shut them up rather quickly at least. And from what I remember, dirty drunk guy probably stumbled onward to some new adventures at some point during that whole thing, and was so drunk that he probably didn't catch much of that incident at all. One time when my dad was a child, he and his family, being his parents, his 2 brothers and his sister, were traveling across the county from Canberra to Albany. There's a significant bit of desert in that drive. It's 3,650 km or 2,268 miles. My father was, and admittedly is, one of the most irritating people in the world. He knows how to push buttons. After one argument too many, in the middle of the desert, my grandfather snapped. The car comes to an abrupt stop. "Get out, Niall's grandfather." So my father obliges. The moment the door shuts behind him, the car speeds off into the distance. My father, about 10 years old, watches it go, shrugs his shoulders, and decides there's no time like the present to get accustomed to your new life, and heads off into the wilderness to try his hand at a life in the wilds. Back in the car, my aunt is in tears, my uncles are stony-faced and tight-lipped, not daring to make a noise, and my grandmother is one moment demanding the next, begging that he turns the car around this minute. In total he drove for no more than 15 minutes before turning around, but when they returned, my father was nowhere to be seen. They did eventually find him, but that's the story of how we were almost the children of a wild man. This was about 25 years ago. My dad is a smart man. He has a master's degree and only didn't get his PhD because he didn't want to have it on his resume out of fear he might intimidate his co-workers. He still took all of the classes, he just never turned in his completed thesis paper, so he never got the degree. One day I, age 12, was at my dad's office. He was writing one last paper on his computer and then we were going to get lunch. I sat patiently while he typed out a few lines, and then he realized he had a typo about one paragraph up. I then watched him delete, one character at a time, everything he had typed, until he got to the typo, deleted it, fixed it, and then retyped everything he had just deleted. A minute or two later, the same thing happened, but this time he just wanted to move one sentence to be later in the paragraph. Again, he deleted everything and retyped it all from scratch. And then he noticed a third typo. "Dad," I yelled. "You know you don't have to do that, right?" "What?" he asked. "Delete everything to fix a typo." And then I showed my dad how to click in the text to insert the marker. While I was at it, I also showed him that you can move text around with the cut, copy, and paste commands. My dad, whom I love dearly, then proceeded to stand up from his computer, walk out of the office, and announce to the entire floor how his genius son had just taught him how to cut, copy and paste, and that if anyone needed a lesson, I could teach them too. So yeah, one time my dad told his entire office that he was a complete moron when it came to computers. TLDR, my father is really just a 54-year-old child who likes to play pranks on us and act like an idiot to make us look bad. One time my dad, my sister, and I were sitting at a diner getting some lunch. My dad and my sister were sitting next to each other on one side of the booth, and I was sitting opposite them. He was being goofy all day, acting like a hyper little kid. He gets this way a lot. He suddenly noticed my menu had an insert and his did not, which he promptly pointed out and shouted, "I don't have one of these." He grabbed my menu and ripped it off the table. My water was accidentally perched on the corner of the menu. When he flipped my menu, he threw my water over and splashed my sister with it. The water was everywhere, even in my sister's purse. She was pissed, but my dad and I were laughing so hard we couldn't even catch our breath. Another time, he, my sister, and I went out to Applebee's right after he had ankle surgery, and he was in a wheelchair. He had been pretending to be mentally disabled all day, so that we looked like assholes when we yelled at him about his behavior. As I've established, my father is a goofball. Our mall is on a little bit of a hill, so the parking lot slopes down from the mall. He suddenly broke away from us and started screaming and waving his arms, still pretending to be mentally disabled, as he rushed down the hill. People ran after his wheelchair and were shooting us dirty looks for ignoring him. They realized that he was just an asshole when he started laughing. One time, my dad went to see my mother when she was recovering from diverticulitis in the hospital. She asked him to bring her something to read. He brought her books on how to build kitchen cabinets. One time my dad woke up and went into the kitchen to get a cup of coffee, like every other morning. Except this wasn't like every other morning. I couldn't sleep that night, so I had come out into the living room, next to the kitchen, to watch the sun rise from the couch. Then, a few hours later, I heard my dad wake up and waited for him to greet me, but he never acknowledged that I was on the couch. Then, I realized that he didn't notice me there in the living room. So my dad goes into the kitchen, pours a cup of coffee, lights up his morning cigarette, and then proceeds to fetch so loudly and for so long that I began to worry something was wrong. Like, he let it rip for a solid 45 seconds. When he finished, he acted like everything was normal and continued preparing his coffee. Then I peeked around the corner and said, "Good morning, Daddy." He jumped, turned around, and stuttered, "I didn't know you were there," clearly trying to suss out whether or not I had heard the fetched. I never mentioned it, and so neither did he. But afterward I went back to my room and laughed for a while about it. One time my dad decided he wanted to show off how resistant to spicy food he was. My little brother and I had come across some sort of absurdly hot pepper taken from my then girlfriend's garden. I had tasted one on my own, and I swear, they nearly blinded me for a couple seconds after munching into them. Anyway, my brother challenges my dad to eat a handful of these little firebombs, and of course my dad can't refuse, as he prides himself on loving spicy food. My dad and my brother are standing in the kitchen. My dad takes a few and starts chewing, and showing no emotion or pain he calls my brother closer to look into his mouth, to see he was chewing them. My dad opens his mouth, and my brother moves close to peer inside. It was at this moment that the heat finally hit my dad. He involuntarily projectile spews the chewed up pepper and pepper juice directly into my brother's open, staring eyes. Nearly immediately, my dad takes off in one direction towards the sink and began running water over his tongue, while my brother ran to the bathroom and, fully clothed, jumps into the shower and rinses out his eyes while screaming he is blind and needs an ambulance. My dad is cackling while he moves on to milk, just pouring it over his tongue into the sink, while I check on my brother, who is sitting looking forsaken on the floor on the shower crying and staring up into the falling water. This one time, my dad chased a guy who stole avocados from a linden tree with a machete and a glorious battle cry. Backstory: I lived in Trinidad growing up. The house I grew up in had 2 yards, one where the house was fenced, the other was separated by the fence and a canal. My dad had a few trees, but his prizes were his avocados. They got to grapefruit sizes. One night the dogs were barking a lot, so my dad came to my room, since it faced the area they were at, to see if he saw what agitated them. He saw the tree shaking vigorously, so went to investigate. I heard him yelling, but saw nothing happen until he opened the gate connecting the yards, letting the dogs out. 3 coy Rottweilers. All I could see was a white sack bolt across the yard toward the canal, then over it, an impressive jump. The dogs stopped, and we thought the sack got away, until we saw car headlights pull up in the distance intercepting the sack, and finally shining light on the guy that it was attached to. Around 10 minutes later my dad comes back inside the house with the sack and his power, known as a big faking machete. He told us that he left in his car when he saw the thief escape the dogs, and he noticed that the direction he was heading to crossed the street we lived on that looped around it and intercepted him, chasing him and threatening to cut his head off and feed it to the dogs. He dropped the sack and vanished. My dad ended up sharing the avocados with some of the neighbors. My dad broke my nose on accident when I was a kid. My father was a Vietnam veteran and a very intense guy. Very quiet, but very caring. I was about 8, and my dad told me some army guy stories. Basically very tame versions of what really happened, because I watched a movie with soldiers in it and decided that's what I wanted to play. He told me about sneaking around in the jungle in the dark, so when it was nighttime I was crawling around the house in the dark. My old man always sat on the couch in the den and watched TV, so I got the brilliant idea to sneak up on him. Was about 3 AM on a Saturday night. Only light on is the TV. He got up cause he heard a noise, probably assuming it was the cat, and I sprang from around the corner and yelled. Next thing I know I feel his knuckles in my face. I'm on the ground and seeing stars. My dad turned on the lights and realized it was me and took me to the hospital. I have very vivid memories of him crying with me in the car on the way there cause he felt so bad. I never quite understood how he had a response like that until I had those experiences for myself in the military, and he shared what really happened in the stories he told me when I was a child, when I came back from rotation the first time. Oh god, I'm going to be way too late for this, but one time my dad walked 37 kilometers for cigarettes. A couple of years ago on the day after Christmas, my mum, dad, brother and I stayed at our cousin's house to catch up and go out for dinner. The day after that, my brother and I were going to Luna Park for a friend's birthday, so we needed to be at the train early and didn't partake in the festivities. See, drinking. So the next day, my brother and I have gone off to Sydney, blissfully unaware of what had been happening at the house while we were gone. When we catch the train back to my parents' house, mum comes to pick us up and tells us to ask dad about his adventure this morning. According to dad, and filled in by mum, what happened was that about 2:30 in the morning dad, still in his drunken state, needed a smoke, but couldn't find any at our cousin's house. So after waking up mum to try and find some, he decided to walk into town to find Smokes, only wearing shorts and thongs. Mum didn't think anything of it because she was also kinda drunk and wanted to go back to sleep. So anyway, mum went back to sleep but woke up about 3:30 and dad still wasn't home. So she got up and drove around my cousin's town for looking for him. She couldn't find him, so she came back and went to sleep on the lounge waiting for him to get back. My brother and I have gotten up at 7 o'clock to go to the train station and he's still not home, so our auntie drops us off and that's the last we hear. Basically what happened was that dad went into town, saw that nothing was open, shocked, and so decided to walk to the 24-hour petrol station along the highway. Mind you, we are nowhere near the highway at this point. So dad walked out of town, up over a rather large hill, and towards the next town over, which was still a fair way off. We are basically in the sticks. Realizing it was too far to walk, dad hitchhiked with an older lady, bummed a smoke off of her, and she dropped him at the turnoff for the highway. Dad then walked along the highway for a while until lo and behold the police show up. Apparently they had gotten calls from drivers saying there was a guy with no shirt stumbling along the highway and they were worried he would get hit. He had nearly made it to the petrol station too. So dad made the cops drive him back to our house, not our cousin's house, another 45 minutes away, because he knew there were Smokes at home. So that was my dad's drunken Smokes adventure. Oh my god, I could fill this thread up with amazing stories. Things like, one time, my dad did heroin for 30 plus years, stayed totally healthy, got clean and lived to tell the tale. One time, my dad bought a plot of land in the middle of the Florida Everglades while drunk, dropped a double-wide trailer there and eventually built it into a mansion. I later found out why he actually bought that land. Yet another story there. One time, my dad left his big coffee can of weed on the table and his autistic Dalmatian ate it all. One time, my dad got hammered and shipwrecked his pontoon boat on a random island in the middle of the Everglades, which led to him and 5 other people being stranded for days with nothing but alcohol to live on. And so on. My dad is basically a living cartoon character. Edit. To paraphrase a friend of mine, I do have a tendency to use a bit of hyperbole when telling stories. The experience is half the fun, right? But the stories about my father are not exaggerated at all. Keep that in mind when reading them. They are simply what they are. My dad is larger than life, reckless, and certifiably faking nuts, but he is who he is, and he's a part of me, and I love him for it. This is long. I had a weird childhood. My parents divorced when I was 2. My mom went on to become an RN and later a sheriff's deputy, and my dad became a Hell's Angel and functional alcoholic. Well, when I was about 16 I went to visit my dad. He lived about 3 hours from us, and I drove myself. By the time I got to his house I had to pop, like, right faking now. So I pull into his driveway pretty fast, jump out of my car and practically run to the front door. I throw open the door and ran into the house with that desperate yawn you only feel when you really have to go and you're only seconds away from relief. I ran through the house and make it to the bathroom in the nick of time. Crisis averted. So I finish up and open the bathroom door to see 3 Hells Angels I don't recognize standing in the hallway in front of the bathroom. Before I can say anything one of them grabs me and slammed me against the wall and starts yelling right in my face. I just keep saying wait, wait, wait. When out of nowhere my dad clocks this guy in the head with a revolver and he falls down dragging me with him. I'm not a big guy, and back then I was probably around 145 at 5 feet 9 inches. My dad, also not a big guy, picks me up by the back of my shirt with one hand and starts going to work on this guy's face. The guy on the ground isn't doing shit. The 2 other guys are yelling at my dad to stop, and my dad is screaming at the guy on the ground, "You laid hands on my son, and you hurt my son in my house." As it turns out, the guy that grabbed me was a prospect, like a probationary Hells Angel member, and had never been to my dad's place before. They had been breaking up some weed in the living room, and saw some unknown goth looking kid in a suit run through the house and lock himself in the bathroom, and they freaked out. My dad heard the yelling and came in from the backyard where there was a detached garage to see me getting manhandled and just saw red. When everything calmed down a little, we went into the living room and there were two scared looking biker chicks and a sheet load of weed on the table. The guy that grabbed me looks faked up, and his girlfriend comes off the couch and is checking his face. My dad looks at him and says, "Motherfucker, go wash his car." Later that night, the poor guy that my dad beat the shit out of asked me if I wanted to fuck his old lady. I said no, but ended up getting a blowjob from her after I drank a bit too much. She was kind of insistent, and I was young and drunk. The end. Backstory: first, for fun growing up, me and my friends would slide down my stairs in my sleeping bag or boogie boards. The stairs ended, and then there would be a wall. So to protect ourselves and not slamming into the wall, we put pillows down to stop us. Actual dad story. So one night, my parents went out to a party, and I had my neighbor friend staying with me. Well, my parents come home, and my dad is totally wasted. He was chasing us around and just being annoying drunk, so we went to my room to get away from him. We were just there chilling for a while when we heard something near my window, second floor. All of a sudden we hear, "Boo. Ha ha, watch a guy's toin." My father, in his drunken mood, felt the need to go to the garage and get the ladder and climb up and scare us. Well, we ran down the stairs screaming. My mom, who was already in bed, was screaming to him, "Go to bed." Was he done? Oh no, he has seen us slide down the stairs and thought this was the perfect time to do that. We watched him slide down the stairs, but not gracefully. In the end, he broke his watch, and in the process, tweaked his back, which lasted many years. More than one time my dad has said he wanted to show us how it's done and ended up going down in flames. Dad tries to show us how to get maximum sledding speed with roll-up sled. With a running start, goes for the leap and steps on the sled, goes tumbling down the hill face first. Dad tries to show us cool trampoline trick by jumping off of the second floor deck and onto the trampoline. Jumps off the deck, hits the trampoline, bounces sideways and hits the bottom of the deck, then hits the concrete. His ear turned purple and the area swelled up. One time he and I were practicing throwing knives. I was in kindergarten. Threw the knife at a tree, and it bounced back and skimmed his shoulder. Shooting a full unopened 2-liter of Coke with a BB gun. BB bounces back and hits dad. Kindergarten as well. One time he drove a 4-wheeler up a steep side of a hill along a road and backflipped it. More of a tumbled backwards, and was unscathed besides a few scratches. Dad fell out of a pickup truck while it was moving. Dad crashed his truck in a rainstorm in the mountains. Flipped it off a hill into a field. Got home an hour later by walking. No major injuries. Dad accidentally punched his hand through the front screen door's window. Had cut all up. I start to lose track. He was always confident of what is being done though. Going to Disney World for the first time at 4 years old. First plane ride. First real vacation and princesses. Just magic. Day of trip. We head out to airport. Very early, sleepy, but crazy excited. Dad's excited too, which is odd, because dad hates planes. Too many assholes, crowds, also assholes, and going anywhere early, harder to deal with assholes. But, dad loved me, and my excitement was enough. Problem is, dad has a very strict morning routine. Breakfast, coffee, smoke, more coffee, then a nice, long solitary moment on the toilet. This morning he had to skip all but the smoke and coffee. As we pull up to the airport gate, dad lets mom and I out and goes to park. He's gone for a very long time. Mom is pissed and getting anxious. Come to find out, the coffee and smoke had gotten the better of him, and he had a sheet emergency. He thought he could just sink it, but as he started walking to the gate, his creature of habit bowels convinced him otherwise. Legs and his cheeks firmly clenched, he hobbled back to the truck. Dad always kept a towel in the truck, so he did what any reasonable person would have done, and sheet on the towel, while doing a modified leg press in the driver's seat. In a busy airport departure parking lot, at 8:30 AM, on a Monday. Finished with his short quest, he rolled up the towel, and tossed it in the trash bin on the way to meet us. Luckily, this being the post 9 to 11 age, he wasn't seen on security cam throwing an oddly bulky item into an airport trash can. That would have been awkward for the bomb robot. Disney World was magical. TLDL dad shit on a towel in his truck in an airport parking garage because he's a creature of habit. Oh boy. It would almost be easier to list shit my dad didn't do. One time my dad and my mom decided to go visit the wreckage of a hurricane. While the hurricane was still going on, they encountered state troopers who told them at gunpoint to turn the fuck around and get out. They stayed at some hotel with no electricity where some other people who refused to evacuate ended up. Took us to a state park that featured sand dunes and launched us off the lip of one, causing the car to nosedive into the sand. Surprisingly, we in the car was just fine, except one guy who was in the car was not buckled in and got rug burn on his face from his momentum continuing into the ceiling. Was causing a distraction in class and was sent to one of two small rooms in the back of the class. He climbed into the ceiling and over to the other room just to confuse the teacher who came to get him when class was over. The teacher was very confused. Was building a prop shoe that had a knife in the toe that would pop out if you clicked your heels or something. His hand slipped while he was hollowing out the sole, and whatever tool he was using ended up hollowing out a part of his thigh. Amongst other crazy shit that I probably shouldn't share on the internet. One time my dad was doing a semester abroad in Greece, and he decided that he really wanted to climb Mount Olympus. Everyone told him not to do it, as it was a remarkably cold winter and the entire mountain was covered in snow, not to mention the sheer steepness of the climb itself. Believe me, there is a reason that Mount Olympus is the home of the gods, and it's because no sane mortal would ever want to make the climb. But my dad really wanted to impress this cute brunette back home, my mom, and so he decided to go through with it. His plan was to go up the mountain about halfway, where there is a small restaurant camping area. He would spend the night in the warm, heated comfort of the restaurant, and then finish the trail the next day. It started to snow right as he started hiking on the trail, and soon he couldn't see further than 10 feet in any direction. The trail was narrow and winding, and he soon lost the trail and lost his bearings. It started to grow dark, and my dad was completely lost. Finally, he stumbled across a clear spot in the trees. It was a waterfall that had frozen completely solid. However, my dad thought that he had finally found the trail again, and that it was just extraordinarily steep trail. So he began to climb. He would punch a hole in the ice of the frozen waterfall with his fist, and then use the hole as a handhold to climb up. Once he reached the top, he miraculously found the trail. He finally made it to the camping site, only to find that it was closed and no one was there. It had been closed due to the bad weather. My dad, who had planned on spending the night inside a warm, heated room, now had to spend the night outside in the freezing cold with only a sleeping bag. He somehow survived the night, finished the climb, and made it home to America to thoroughly impress my mother. TLDR, my dad punched finger holds in a frozen waterfall to climb up Mount Olympus. My dad passed away 2 weeks ago, and I'm probably late to this. There are lots of these stories though. One time my dad asked me and my friends if we knew what to do when getting roadhead, and then proceeded to drive on the rumble strip. One time my dad bought a basket full of expired boat flares for like $1 each, normally like $50 each. They go up 1,000 foot and come down bright red on a parachute. We set a few off at a friend's house up in NH, and a few days later there was a front page story in the local paper about a UFO sighting. When my friends were setting up tents in our backyard, my dad approached them and said, "If I had a tent like this, I'd take a good looking broad, like my wife, and fuck the shit out of her." One time my dad gave up looking for a good spot to grow weed along the river behind our house, knocked a hole in the wall in the basement and dug out a secret grow room. One time my dad built a radar gun that sent the same signal that radar detectors detect. Basically what the cops have, but it doesn't bother to calculate speed, and we would use it to occasionally make us whole drivers slow down. One time my dad gave a big guy with a ton of luggage a ride across the harbor in a small aluminum boat. The ferry came by and the waves sank them. My dad retrieved all of the guy's luggage and the outboard motor, which had sank 20 feet to the bottom. He rebuilt the motor that was already 40 years old, and it ran for another 15 years. That's all for now. Rest easy, Dad. Once my dad wrestled a bear in Gatlinburg. There was a ring set up, and it was $50 to enter. The bear had large mitts on its paws and a muscle, so it was supposed to be less dangerous. The bear had been trained to wrestle and pin his opponent, and watching him with the other men he seemed domesticated, and we could tell he was rather tame. Dad signed a waiver stating we wouldn't sue, and they were not liable for any injuries yada yada. So he gets a helmet and goes in shirtless despite mom freaking out and trying to talk him out of it. The bell rings, and immediately the bear snags him up and takes him to the ground, but dad was rather stout from being a pipe fitter and wrestling all through high school. It must have been his dad's strength, because he was starting to outmaneuver it. They were in a tangled mess when all of a sudden I hear the loudest and most cringe-worthy animal squeal I have ever heard. Then dad pins it down. Everyone loses their minds and is cheering. Pointy stands up and is sweating a lot. Some people come to check on the bear and the promoter, jaw dropped, comes over and says no one has ever come close to beating this thing, and ask him how in the hell he was able to pin that bear down. He'll never forget what dad said. He told him, after it took him down the first time, when they were tangled on the ground, he looked up and saw a huge set of nuts right in front of his face. He couldn't move his arms, so he just bit them as hard as he could. The promoter wasn't truly in, or he kind of shook his head in disbelief and exclaimed, "Oh my god, you really bit that grizzly's tentacles." Dad looked down in shame and said no, they weren't his, they were mine. So, my dad was an angry man. One day, years ago, he was working up in his office, and I was playing one of his guitars in my room. I was having trouble getting the thing in tune, and decided to go ask him for help. Upon entering his office, I was met with a stream of expletive grumbling directed at the clock radio. He was angrily and unsuccessfully trying to tune to the CBC. Realizing I was about to step upon a figurative hornet's nest, I began quietly backtracking out of the room, but it was too late. I'd been detected. "Dad, what you want?" Young Obsidian. "Oh, the guitar. Can't seem to get it in tune." At that point my dad stopped fiddling with the radio, took the guitar from my hand, tuned it perfectly in about 4 seconds, and handed it back to me. I should mention that all this time his radio was squealing and crackling over the voice of Karloff, and his grimaced face was turning a dark shade of red. Seeing my chance to escape, I quickly left the office, climbed the ladder down from the loft, and made a mental note to avoid him for the rest of the day. This is when my mum called, asking to speak with my dad. Great. So, I make my way down the hallway and call up to my dad. "Young Obsidian, hey dad. Fuck." From upstairs I could hear commotion, desk items being knocked over, and the familiar stream of grumbling expletives that were so common in my young life, and then, bang, the unmistakable sound of a small cube-shaped clock radio being hurled at and hitting the wall. Now, as I mentioned, the office was in the loft, so the clock radio, after hitting the wall, fell 2 levels into the basement with my very angry dad hot on its heels. So I follow him into the basement, keeping a respectable distance, and giving my mum a play-by-play, because I'm still on the phone with her, and she's just as invested in seeing the culmination of my dad's overboiling anger as I am. My dad picks up the clock radio, still grumbling, kicks in the door to his workshop, and stomps directly to the workbench, where he starts swinging open the big, old-timey wooden vise attached to the bench. I watch in horror as I begin to piece together just what he has in mind for the poor little cube-shaped clock radio. "Mum, what's he doing?" Young Obsidian. "He's clamping his clock radio in the vise." "Mum, what?" Young Obsidian. "He's gonna kill it." Once the clock radio was secured in the vise, he reached for a large roofing hammer and began smashing the poor thing over and over. Clock radio pieces flying about the room, hitting the walls and the glass door that separated me from the absolute bedlam not 3 meters away. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the sublime catharsis that follows beating the ever-loving shit out of an inanimate object. My father sure is. After finishing up with the clock radio and taking a few deep breaths, he calmly removed the clock radio from the vise, well, what was left of it, dropped it in the trash, put his hammer away, and went outside to sit on the deck. I asked my mum, who was still on the phone, to call him back in a while, and I made myself scarce. My favorite part of all this is that several years later, when packing my things to move out on my own, I moved some boxes in the basement/workshop, and what did I find behind them? A few chunks of white plastic from his crappy old cube-shaped clock radio. A long time ago my aunt and uncle had just bought their first house together, so my uncle came to pick my dad and I up to go see it. Typical brothers, they started wrestling. Not like on the ground attacking each other, just like I don't know standing up like grabbing arms and like headlocks and stuff. It started in the dining room, went through the kitchen, through the hallway, then to the laundry room. The rooms are almost in a straight line. Now, for some reason our house is like filled with doors. There's a door separating the end of the hallway from the laundry room, which is connected to the garage, through a door that directly lines up with the laundry room door. Then through the garage there's another door to outside. Each door also had a glass window in it, not anymore. So as they're wrestling over to the door to leave, they squeezed through the laundry room door. I think my uncle was getting my dad in a headlock at that point or something. So my dad's natural reaction, when standing within arm's reach of a window, is to fling his shoulders, and my uncle's went with them, through the garage door window. I was behind them, and also like 6 or 7, and all I hear is grunting, then slam crash, then glass shattering and falling to the floor. I started freaking out, because when your arms are exposed, because you're only wearing a t-shirt, then you slam your arms through a window, you're probably going to get hurt. Miraculously, no one was hurt. They quickly swept up, and as we got in the car I was told, do not tell mom. My child adrenaline was still pumping, and I was crying, so I kinda broke that rule as soon as mom saw me and asked why I was crying. She surprisingly thought it was hilarious. Needless to say, we've got plastic in the windows now, just for when that uncle comes to visit. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. I grew up in the woods. So when it got dark, it stayed dark. And when I was a kid, my parents, both of whom I loved dearly, used to do what parents are apt to do, with their kid. So, I grew up playing in those woods and whatnot. Anyway, my dad casually mentions one day that he heard the pygmies again last night in the woods. I didn't know what a pygmy was, although the being fairly well versed in weird stuff as a kid, so he explained that they were tiny people, cannibals, forgotten by the world, and that they had a tribe in our woods. Okay, so I had 2 chores as a kid besides the usual stuff. I would have to take the trash out to the street, which our driveway was over 1,000 plus feet, and feed the dog. The dog coop was across the yard, a good distance away. Well, I got caught up watching DBZ on Toonami, and it was dark by the time I had to feed the dog. As I said earlier, when it got dark, it stayed dark. The only form of light came from this little 60-watt bulb on the corner of the garage, which was also across the yard, and we had a big yard, but it was opposite to the dog coop. So, I grabbed the food, flipped on the light, the switch was by the front door, and made my way into blackness. Now, I know I could have taken a flashlight, but I was carrying a water jug and a bowl of nasty wet and dry mix, and I was just a kid. Had I been smart I would have grabbed one of the headlamps we had. So, halfway to the dog coop, the light from the garage goes out. It's quiet. I mean, it sounded like the Viet Cong had retreated into the jungles, lying in wait. There was nothing. Then the drums started. Tribal beats, accentuated with whooping and hollering. I could hear them, the pygmies, parading through the trees, but I couldn't see them. That's when I hear my dad. Run. They're coming. I faking hauled us to the dog coop and locked myself in there with my immensely huge German Shepherd, Dupree. She was just happy to have someone around, but I was sheeting myself. That's when the laughing started. Something I didn't mention. My dad's a deadhead, and as the years have gone by I have become one as well. Well, he put on a recording from the Rainforest Benefit, MSG, the 24th of September 1988, the drums portion of it. Most of the dead stuff in the 80s 95 had a drums and space section, just straight jams, which is tribal enough. But also had chanting in it. Even though I can hear him laughing his ass off, I'm still convinced that the damn pygmies are after me. God, I love my parents. I know this is going to be buried, since I'm late to the party, but I have to share. I was going through a major depressive episode, and staying at my father's for a little while. At the worst of times, I used to go long periods without eating, and my dad would notice, but wouldn't know how to deal with it. So, one day he was in the kitchen, and I came downstairs, and he goes, "Want something to eat?" Not really. You haven't eaten. Let's check the pantry and see if there's anything you want. I hadn't had an appetite in days, and the thought of food made me feel sick, but I knew he was trying, so I felt like I should try for him. We go through every food or snack item in the pantry together, and eventually we spot it, Pringles. And something sparked. I actually wanted the Pringles. I tell him that I'd love some, and he grins a huge grin, and I grab the tube of Pringles. And immediately, as if she had a radar, my stepmother came down the stairs and yelled, "Do not eat those Pringles. Those are for my half-brother. Put them back." Disappointed that I couldn't eat the only thing that clicked with me in a long period of time, but not wanting to start cheat, I put the Pringles back in their spot like she said. And immediately, my dad loses it. "What the fuck?" he bellowed, stomping over to her. "Why the fuck can't she have them?" "Because they're for brother. I bought them. He has all sorts of snacks. She can't have this one thing." This escalated into a full-scale argument. And I mean the screaming until the neighbors hear, in each other's face argument. I felt so fucking bad for starting it that I just sulked into my room and tried making myself as quiet and as small as possible. I didn't mean for them to fight. I just wanted some Pringles, and I was sure my brother wouldn't mind anyways. After maybe 10 minutes of yelling, I heard the door slam and saw my father's car pull out of the driveway. I tried distracting myself by playing The Sims 2 or doing something where I didn't have to think. He eventually returned, and I went down into the garage to apologize and tell him I didn't mean to make him so upset. In his arms were about 10 grocery bags full of nothing but Pringles. Every flavor available in 2010 you could buy at fucking Walmart. He cleared the shelves of all of their damn Pringles. More Pringles than I could ever hope for. My dad was carrying them all with a sweaty red face and a huge grin. "Now," he said, holding his arms out so I could take a bag, "you can have as many Pringles as you want. TLDR, I don't eat for a long time. Tried eating Pringles, got yelled at by my stepmom for doing so, and my dad bought a giant collection of Pringles for me. I'm sure this will get buried. TLDR, my dad had Alzheimer's, and I got to take him out in his Camaro for some good old-fashioned fun. My dad has always loved classic muscle cars. When I was about 7 he bought a 1969 Camaro SS with a 396. I learned how to do basic mechanics on that car. He was super protective of it, and when working on it, you couldn't have any zippers or buttons that might come into contact with the paint. He had special blankets he'd lay on the fenders, so you could lean into the engine. The time spent in the garage with my dad was some of my best memories. When I was about 14, my dad was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. He was only in his 50s. It started out as just being forgetful, and after several years of decline he was unable to drive. My mom would drive him everywhere. Well, she hated the Camaro. It was too much power and too much responsibility for her to drive. She would drive it rarely, just to make him happy, but she hated it. She called me up one day and asked if I would take him for a drive in the Camaro. It was unreal. None of us kids had ever gotten to drive it. This was his baby. I swear he loved it more than his actual kids. So I go over there and get the keys, and we head off. At this point in his disease, he had forgotten that I was his daughter. He knew who I was, but didn't know I was related to him. So he starts complaining that Nancy, my mom, was always really boring to ride with. He said she wouldn't do burnouts or drive fast or anything. So I took that as permission. After a couple hours of burnouts, speeding, and general jacassery, I took him home. My mom said that is the happiest she'd seen him in a long time. After that, it became a weekly thing. I'd pick him up, and we'd go be obnoxious in the Camaro. This has been several years ago, and he's been gone for 9 years, but this is still one of my favorite memories. He was himself during those car rides, not the disease. Sorry for the long story. I just love telling this story. One time I took my younger brother and his friends to play some football at the schoolyard across the street. Now mind you, I'm 3 years older than them and was 15 at the time. Anyway, in the middle of the game these 4 dudes in my grade showed up at the field and decided they wanted to play a game of tackle football against my brother, his friends and I. Now my brother is a tough kid and was even back then So he didn't back down, but he was 12. They began to beat on this group of 12-year-olds and I could only do so much. So anyway, I shot my dad a text saying this group of kids were picking on my brother. Next thing I knew, my dad walked over and asked why they felt the need to play tackle against a group of younger kids, and they said they wanted to play us. So my dad, who is 6 feet 2 and about 240 at the time, says, so then you won't mind if I play then? They said sure, so he joined our team. So the first play in the huddle, he leans in and asks me which one of them is the leader. I pointed to the biggest one. He patted me on the head and said I got him. The first play was a kickoff. It went right to my dad. Mistake number 1. The biggest dude lined up to try and tackle my dad, probably thinking he was gonna take it easy. Mistake number 2. My dad ran full speed, lowered his shoulder, and laid this kid out. I mean, like this it belonged in an NFL highlight reel. My brother and I started dying laughing. The kid's friends ran over to their buddy on the ground crying and said, what the hell, man? What's your problem? My dad responded, you said you wanted me to play. Doesn't feel good, does it? Ball game. Let's go, boys. My brother and I followed and laughed the entire way home. We still talk about it today. The best part was the kid that got hit apologized to me the next day in school. Goddamn, I love my dad. I'm probably too late to the party, but I'll never forget when I realized my dad is hardcore as fuck. We live in rural upstate New York, and when I was about 5 or 6 I went with my dad to help a neighbor stack some hay bales in his barn. The neighbor's teenage son was there helping us as well. I don't remember where his father was, but he wasn't there for some reason. We had to get the hay bales from the truck to the loft of the barn, so one person would stand at the edge of the loft with a big hook and another would stand on the bed of the truck and toss the bales up for them to catch with the hook. My dad was tossing the bales up to the neighbor's son. The boy was not paying any attention to what my dad was doing and was basically flailing the hook down, and at one point he hooked my dad's arm right through the forearm, all the way through. When the kid noticed what the fuck he had just done and saw blood pouring out of my dad's arm, he just passed out and fell from the loft edge onto the truck. Without a single complaint, my dad picks the kid up and drives us all to the hospital 30 minutes away with the hook still in his arm. I knew at that moment my dad was a faking savage. Mad respect. This is way late to the party, but I have so many amazing stories about my dope dad. He used to work for with Waze and would take trips to Antarctica for months on end to drill ice cores at McMurdo Station. One time, he brought me back penguin feathers. At my elementary school we used to have an annual Halloween party, and every year he would come dressed up in something crazy. One year, he was Jack Sparrow, and I swear to God the resemblance was uncanny. He even brought a real sword with him to an elementary school. Another year he was a farm fairy and wore well eyes, overalls, a tutu, and a straw hat, and walked into the playground on stilts. One time I tried to jump up onto the curb on my bike and ate shit and busted my knee, and he could see that I was about to cry, so he goes, "Whoops, come on, you gotta keep pedaling or the blood in your knee won't flow and it won't heal properly." So I biked all the way back to my house. One time he was biking in the woods and he ate shit so badly that his friend had to go get help and left him alone on the trail. So my dad, who now couldn't walk, started dragging himself up the trail bit by bit until his friend came back and found him and got him to the hospital. He wears kilts on a semi-regular basis. He has a tattoo on his arm of a mermaid and the turtle holding the earth on its back that my mom hates. There are a lot more. That's just what I can think of off the top of my head. My papa is great. So growing up I was kind of my dad's driving buddy, more so than my siblings. This culminated at Christmas 2004. We were living in Ohio, and for the holidays were staying with family in the northern part of the mitten of Michigan. And for Christmas my dad had bought a sailboat on eBay. My siblings didn't know about the boat, but my mom and I did. The boat was in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, past Green Bay on the little tip of Wisconsin that sticks out into the lake. We set out at 7 a.m. December 24th to go get this boat. The theory being that we would be able to return around 11 p.m. and surprise my siblings Christmas morning. The drive out around the Upper Peninsula was pretty painless. We worked through a Harry Potter audiobook and talked about school. We were about an hour late getting to Sturgeon Bay. No problem. We hucked the trailer up and set out the other way. Around 6 my dad wants to stop for dinner. Except it's the Upper Peninsula on Christmas Eve. No major citizen, nothing is open. We found a gas station and had chips and pop for dinner. That's okay, we continue to drive. Then around 7 it started snowing. Big fat flakes. Thick and heavy. Neither of us had ever seen snow like that before. He's not from the Midwest originally and neither am I. And to top it off, I was all of 14 and couldn't drive. So around 9 he's getting a little tired. But we are still moving, albeit slowly due to the snow. I go to sleep. I wake up at 1 in the morning as my dad opens the car windows. Because we are still at least an hour out, and it is still snowing. And he's tired. He starts blasting music, whatever he had in the car at the time, and singing along to try to stay awake. Made me sing too. We got back around 3 AM. My siblings thought it was the best Christmas ever. I will be telling my children about their crazy grandpapa and the time we drove through a Michigan snowstorm in Christmas. And when I get married, the father-daughter dance is going to be to Sweet Caroline by Neil Diamond. Because that's what my dad played all through the storm, until we got back. The family joke is that my dad is a cat lady. He's got a supernatural ability with them. We've got to that sleep on his lap every night, follow him around the house, and come running when he calls. At his work, feral cats roam the grounds, so he brings Ziploc bags of cat food in his lunchbox and even cut a doggy, Kitty, flap into the door of his shop so they could come and go when he wasn't at work. Now there are several formerly feral cats at his work that sleep on his lap at lunchtime. Dude loves cats. Anyway, years ago, our next door neighbor hated any animal that wasn't his yappy as Papillon dog. He set up a cage in his backyard with cat treats inside. Our fat old cat, Kibba, got locked in the trap and we didn't see her for over 24 hours. My dad was visibly upset all day, kept going outside and calling for her, but no luck. Like I said, he could lean over the stairwell and call her name and she'd come running from wherever she was in the house, so this looked bad. It was early morning and my dad was standing outside calling for Kibba. He went out towards the fence a bit, still calling her name. At this point, the cat had been in the cage for 24 hours during a Nevada November, damn cold at night. He hears a weak, distress meow and recognizes it. He peeks over the fence, and he can't see her, but can still hear her beneath our neighbor's trampoline. It's 8 in the morning at this point, and my dad is still in his slippers and bathrobe, with nothing underneath. He doesn't go back in to change, no. My 57-year-old father scales the fence, climbs under the trampoline, breaks the cage open and saves his cat. He did let me know that he scraped his junk while going over the fence though. So one time my 57-year-old dad scraped his balls climbing a fence to save his favorite cat. That made for a fun story that night at Thanksgiving dinner. Posted this story elsewhere, but my dad got half his nipple bitten off by a bluegill once. 'Twas a hot summer day. The shuffle of the dry breeze through the sweet acacias was only occasionally interrupted by the low hum of a jet ski motor somewhere off in the distance across the lake. I was told sound travels farther underwater, so I would sometimes stick my head beneath the warm surface, feeling the gradients of temperature caress my face as I strained for signs of other people from somewhere around a distant bend. Being midweek, the reservoir was quite devoid of human life and run-ins with neighbors were infrequent. We were free to do as we pleased, and as such, we decided to drift over to a small island about 50 yards offshore, exposed by the low water levels. It was an uneventful journey, even more so once we reached our destination. The same vegetation, same thirsty soil that could be found on the opposite bank, or anywhere around the shoreline for sure. After a brief tour of the enclave, we boarded our vessels for the return trip to camp. Our trusty inner tubes had not failed us yet, and we were brave seamen. The calm waters belied the dangers lurking below. However, my dad, may his nipple rest in peace, was laying across the inner tube, his exposed flesh immersed through the inner part of his craft. With the port in plain sight, not more than 20 feet away, he reared from the water with a yelp of pain, a wail that I can still hear late at night, and, to this day 20 years later, still makes me laugh. He abandoned ship in roughly waist-deep water, his wound announcing itself in processions of red-tainted streaks, beating down his pasty posterior. The rest of us, kids and wife alike, had seen enough movies and known that in life or death situations, women and children come first. Armed with that knowledge, we boldly ran ours ashore and left Dad to his fate. Somehow, he overcame the onslaught of marine malice and dragged himself to safety. Adrenaline levels racing, he decided to exact his revenge and assembled his weaponry, a fishing pole, probably from Walmart. "Those bastards are hungry," came his war cry as he launched himself into what can only be described as one of the most boring and fruitless battles ever waged by man against beast. The only bite to be had that day had already been claimed. One time my dad took me to a downtown mall when I was little. As we made our way to the food court, we noticed an envelope sitting on one of the tables containing $50 in coins. Excited, I asked my dad what we should spend it on, but he had another idea. He took the envelope to the lost and found. There was a pleasant security guard behind the desk at the time. She informed my father that, if no one claimed the envelope in 2 hours, it would be ours 2 hours later. We returned to the security guard who informed us that no one arrived to claim the envelope. My father kept the envelope in his pocket as we made our way outside the mall. A block over, we noticed a homeless old man perched quietly in a wheelchair with only one arm and one leg. My father gave the envelope to me and instructed me to give it to the man. When I asked him why, my father replied with, "Because some people need it more than we do." I'm a middle-class female with my own financial struggles. But I'll never forget the teary-eyed look in the old man's eyes when we gave him the money. He continuously blessed and thanked us. It's been over 20 years, and I don't know whatever happened to that man. Nonetheless, I'll never forget that day for the rest of my life. My father taught me that we all have our struggles, some more than others. A small gesture of kindness can really help save a person's day, let alone a life. Edit. Words. Being a bit older than the average Redditor, and also being born later in my parents' lives, my dad was exposed to a very different America than anything close to current experiences. I often forgot this, growing up, but every once in a while, a reminder comes along that cannot be ignored. I was around 13 at the time, and the year was 1984. We both happened to be in the backyard within earshot of each other that afternoon, the day both overcast and humid. I spotted a rather large snake in the grass and hollered to him so he'd know. I wasn't particularly concerned for myself, but I didn't know what kind of snake it was, and there was the chance for danger to our two family dogs. Dad did the prudent thing, penning both dogs to keep them out of harm's way, then proceeded to withdraw into the house. Initially, I assumed he's gone to go get one of his guns, but when he returned, he held a rolled up bullwhip that I'd never really seen him use. I spent perhaps a minute in jaw agape or as, after 2 misses, he struck the water moccasin square in the head hard enough to either stun it or kill it, followed by a 4th strike, which popped its head clean off. It was actually a couple of years before I thought to ask him how he'd learned to do that. As it turned out, he'd grown up on a farm, rode horses, loved westerns as a kid, and practiced tricks with a bullwhip for many years. He'd never shown off for me, but when he went in the house, he was faced with a dilemma. Because use of firearms was strongly discouraged in city limits, and using a machete would put him within striking range, he decided to consider alternatives. But instead of trying his luck with a rake or hoe, he went for the whip. It was, shall we say, memorable. My dad, 2 brothers and I did a trip through California for about 2 weeks in one of those huge camper vans, one with a shower, bathroom, TV, etc. On the day before we had to return the camper, we were tidying up and packing our stuff. 2 of the things on the to-do list were 1, refilling the water tank, and 2, emptying the tank which contained all the piss, shit and vomit. My youngest brother had his first couple of beers, which had accumulated for over 2 weeks. We told our dad that we could do those things near or at the rental place, which was about a day's drive away. Also this would be better because then we could still use the bathroom during our last day drive. Anyway, my dad always had a tendency to wake up at 5:30 AM and this morning was no different. We were all sound asleep in the camper and he decided that he would already empty the waste tank and fill the water tank. It being so early, it was quite dark. So he attached the water hose to the wrong socket, the waste socket, and proceeded to fill the waste tank with water. This usually took a while, so he took a short walk. Minutes later he came back and saw water running from the camper. He quickly shut off the water, opened the door, saw weeks of sewage, which had come up from the bathroom, streaming from our camper and started yelling, "No, no, no." We woke up from the noise and were literally surrounded by sheet. Barefoot I walked to the sheet stream and helped push out the sheet through the door opening. We cleaned all morning and had the smelliest, in very warm weather, drive ever. Thanks Dad. Only when I got older this left me with so many questions. Why wasn't there a mechanism which prevented the water hose to be connected to the sewage tank? Why did we have to fill the water before a turn? How on earth did we not have to pay damages? We masked the smell by emptying a few bottles of cheap cologne in tech camper. So during the review the guy came inside and was like, "What's that smell?" My dad told him that I had broken my bottle of cologne. The guy had a really brief look and then said everything was alright. TLDR, I literally woke up in a stream of sheet. My dad was amazing, a total hippie that had a hard time accepting the ways of life in the 80s. I miss him more and more now that I'm a dad. He truly loved my brother and I, and also was an awesome friend on top of being a real dad. I have many stories about him. He was unique. Never liked rules, always tried to go against the grain of society, could build anything, and smoked more weed than anyone I have ever met. First story goes like this. My family, brother, mom, myself and dad were traveling along the turnpike heading to Angola, Indiana for a car show. We stopped at Hardee's for a bite, which was rare for us, because at the time my dad had us on a strict health regulations. We grew what we ate mostly. So, we order our food. He gets a burger of some sort. We sit down, start munching, then he realizes, after taking a bit from his burger, that it's not what he ordered. He closes the cardboard burger container and walks up to the manager behind the counter and lets them know they gave him the wrong burger. The lady then turns around and puts the burger back on the rack with all the other pre-made burgers. My dad said nothing about the bite missing. In the 80s, burger joints had a rack with separate slots behind the counters with various burger types. Anyways, my dad came back to the table like, "Holy shit, we gotta stick around and see who gets this burger." Our luck, after 10 minutes or so a big burly bro, the trucker, walks in and orders what my dad had returned. We patiently waited and hoped for the best, that he did not order the food to go. Our luck, he ordered in and then sat directly across from us. The man sits down, opens the container, but doesn't see the bite at first. He then grabs the burger and takes a bite of the opposite side, while not really paying attention to what he's eating. Then while chewing he starts to inspect the burger, notices the bite on the backside of it. This man screamed like a young girl at the top of his lungs, and dropped the burger on the tray below. My mom had to run to the bathroom, because she started to cry, because of laughing so hard. My dad just sat and watched the events unfold. The man had a serious meltdown on the manager, screaming, "This goddamn burger has a faking bite out at it. You see that sheet?" The manager was in disbelief and tried to make it seem like the guy was crazy. The whole place went quiet. He did not let up with the yelling. My dad figured we had seen enough, so he grabbed us up and we ran out there laughing hysterically. So even at a young age, me and my dad never really hugged. He was an awesome dad and there was no lack of love. I just grew up in a very masculine household where men shook hands and didn't hug. Anyways, one night when I was about 11, 12-ish years old, I was on my way to bed and said goodnight to my parents as I passed their room. My dad stopped me and said, "Hey, come here for a secretary." So I peeked my head in and said, "What's up?" He said, "Come here and give your father a hug. We don't hug enough." Naturally, I was taken back and somewhat repulsed by this foreign request. I thought to myself, either he's drunk or dying of some terminal disease or something. So I crept slowly toward him with a very puzzled look on my face and stopped about 3 feet away. I stared at him for a couple seconds until he opened his arms and smiled. I've never given such a reluctant hug in my life, and in that moment I was dumbfounded and confused. As soon as I get within grabbing range he puts me in a headlock, pulls the covers over my head and yells covered wagon. It was then that I realized I've been bamboozled. The smell of 1,000 dead corpses filled my nose, and I was overcome with nausea and began to gag. He let me go, only because he thought I was gonna yak on him. TLDR, me and dad never hugged. One day dad asked for a hug in bed. I reluctantly complied, only to find out he let out a horrible flatulence under the covers, at which point he trapped me and pulled them over my head. So this was when Blockbuster was still a thing. When I was in middle school, me and dad had to run some errands. One of them was to drop off some movies my parents had rented. Okay, no big deal, I've done this before. I get out the car, put it in the drop box and go. Well, on this day, when we pull in, we see a truck with a window axe sticking out the back window. Like they were actually using to cool their truck. It's the middle of July in southern USA, so it's hot. Whatever, so we pull up. Now mind you, our windows are up. We park and we both look at each other, and I said to dad, my god, what is that smell? Dad looks past me, which caused me to look out my window, and I see the truck full of trash. Me, is that the truck we are smelling? Why do they have a window ack? Oh my god, those are large PPL in a small truck. My dad covering his nose at this point. Here's the movies, Mob Princess, go drop them off. Me, what, why? I didn't even watch those movies. Those are yours and mom's. Dad, BC, I'm not getting out and smelling that even more, and because I told you to do it. Now hurry up so we can leave. So I was mad, but I get out choking on the cloud of stench that took up the parking lot to drop off his movies. The whole time I just see my dad laughing so hard he's crying. I get in the car and tell him to go so we can get away from the smell, and he's still laughing so hard he can't drive. I got a lot of stories like that from younger years. He was a good man and still makes me laugh to this day. I do love him. I just get to see how his and mom's drinking has turned them in the shells of who they once were. I was about 10 or 11, my older brother 12 or 13. Both of us are in the same scout group. Mum was a Beaver Scout leader and dad was a scout leader in my group. The scout group were putting on a fight at the local park. They did every year, so my entire family were at the park helping to set up. Of course, my brother and I weren't helping at all. We were dicing around on our bikes, as you do at that age. So, we ride off around the park and my brother says he needs a piss. Instead of opting for a bush, he decides to use the public toilets. As I'm waiting outside with both bikes, a couple of much older teenagers approach me and simply grab my brother's bike. My brother exits the toilets at this point and is obviously like, that's my bike. Being the gobby little oik I was, I started mouthing off to the older boys and tried to grab the bike back. For which I received a swift, brutal, and instantly flooring kick in the nuts. I'm 10 or 11 and a proper short ass. This older boy is probably 17 or 18. What the fuck? The two older boys drop my brother's bike and fuck off quite quickly after I've started screaming and crying, holding on to my little boy nuts on the floor. My brother calmly tells me to wait where I was. I wasn't going anywhere anyway, and rides off to tell mum and dad, who are no more than 60 seconds away, but completely out of sight and earshot. I should probably mention at this point in the story that my dad had a bit of a thing for the Land Rover Defender and County at the time, and had recently purchased an ex-military 110 Defender, replete with camo net to cover the entire vehicle, exterior gun mount and infrared headlights. Cut back to me, still writhing on the floor by the toilet block, and all I can hear is what is obviously my dad's Land Rover, absolutely faking belting it. I get up and sure enough, there's dad, charging through trees across the park to where I was. Get in, he shouts at me, my brother hanging out of the back to help me up. We then spend a couple of minutes of what can only be described as reckless/heroic off-roading, bouncing through a public park, trying to find the wankers that had kicked me. We find them and immediately tell my dad which one was the ball breaker. My dad, dressed in combats with massive boots and an army-ish sort of jumper on, flies out of the Land Rover and stomps his way over to the two lads. He's really angry. The next 30 seconds will stay with me forever. My dad grabs the boy by his throat, gently of course, and says to him, "This is about the same height difference between you and I as it is between you and my son. The boy's looking fucking petrified. My dad then proceeds to lift him off the ground with one arm, his hand now sort of under his chin, more than around his throat. Think yourself lucky I don't want to go to jail, else you'd be getting exactly the same, my dad says to the boy, massively angry and threatening. He puts the boy back down, and the two of them ran off. Very quickly. Through all of this, I've just been watching my dad, thinking faking hero. Absolute faking. Hero. I couldn't believe it was my dad doing this. It was like watching a film. He was everything I needed him to be that day, and more. Dad, you rock. TLDR. Older boy threatens to take brother's bike. He kicks me in the nuts. My dad charges illegally through a public park in an ex-military Land Rover and scares the shit out of said older boy. Hero. My dad told me about the time he egged his town with his friends. They had a friend who worked in the grocery store that would secretly give them cartons of eggs, and they would hide them on top of the rooftops in town. The houses were close enough together that you could pretty much run rooftop to rooftop, except for one house where the only way to clear the gap was to jump into a tree and then jump from the tree to the other house. So on Halloween, they had a ton of eggs on the rooftops of the houses that had gone pretty much rancid having been there for so long. They took to the rooftops and began egging every house in sight. They egged this one guy's car too. The guy in the car got out and immediately zeroed in on this kid, dressed as Dracula, and starts shouting at him. He picks the poor kid up and starts wiping the eggs off his car with the kid. So my dad and his friends hit that guy with a few eggs and ran off. Eventually the police were called and ended up chasing my dad and his friends across the rooftops. They all ran to the house with the tree in the large gap and jumped to the tree, then to the house. The police didn't want to risk the jump, and my dad and his friends were able to get away. It went down as the worst egging in their town's history. One time my dad and I went to the movies together. It was Avatar, and would have been our last movie together. I was also 7 months pregnant with my first son. I was under some sort of impression that I could go into labor and have the baby at any time, so that's what I kept telling people. So we are in the movie theater, and we are courteous movie goners, so we turn off our cell phones. When the movie ended, and we got out, we turn our phones back on only to find that my mom and brother were blowing up both of our phones. We had several missed calls and texts. Dad never told them we were going to the movies, and they spent the evening going to every hospital and police station in the city and all the surrounding cities looking for us, thinking I had gone into labor. He thought it was the funniest thing ever. Another one. My dad was a very large man, standing at about 6 feet 5 inches and weighing around 350 lbs. He also had a beard and a loud booming voice. You knew when you were in trouble. One day, I was upstairs in my room and my dad yells my name. I reply sweetly, yes, daddy, you know, because I'm a girl and I don't want to be in trouble lol. He yells back, get your ass down here. I about sheet myself. I walk up behind him as he's playing EverQuest and say in my sweetest voice again, yes daddy. He turns and looks at me and says, hey, can you hand me that drink right there? I look over and the drink was on the dining table literally 2 feet away from him. I said, what the fuck, dad? You're an asshole. Stormed off to my room while he was laughing his ass off. Miss that man. My dad had a Suburban when we were younger. It was perfect for taking family trips, towing our trailer, etc. Especially since there were 3 kids and everyone always wanted to bring a friend or boy/girlfriend. My family used to go to a tree farm every year to tag a tree, ride the tractor, and have the idea. One year I brought my buddy along with us. We did our thing and left to go home. On the way back, my friend who was sitting behind my father decided to say this. UHH, Mr. Dr. Transfertility Van. I don't mean to alarm you, but there is a giant spider on your shoulder. No joke, this thing was the size of your fist. It was a wood spider or similar breed that must have gotten on him earlier on the farm. Somehow we didn't notice until it was too late. My father glanced over, saw it, and totally flipped out. While on the highway he cut over 3 lanes of traffic to the shoulder, slammed on the brakes, opened the door, and started the show. He ripped off his jacket, but apparently that wasn't enough. He then started stepping on his jacket, flailing around like a man on fire. All of this happening on the shoulder of the interstate. When he finally regained his composure, he calmly walked back to the truck, started it up, and said, "I got it." One of my favorite stories on my father. My dad solved my bullying of 1 to 2 years in an afternoon. I had been bullied for like 1 to 2 years, but it never felt like anyone ever really tried too hard to solve it. It wasn't major, but it did exist. My mum was sympathetic and tried to fix it civilly, not the method my dad took. The school didn't try too hard to fix it, more just saying stop to the bullies. It wasn't until one day where the two people who were bullying me jumped me that my dad took action. He thought things were being solved, so he never really got involved. I didn't get him involved, since he worked most of the time and I only really ever saw him sleeping. But basically after he heard what happened, a week later I should add, he charged into the school and went off on them, kicked their butts into gear, and managed to get them to actually try and stop the bullying. He managed to solve my issue in an hour, and it was incredible. It really shaped who I'm today. My mum is still the same. She likes to solve stuff civilly. She went off on my dad though for what he did, but he stood his ground. I'm having similar issues now with school, not bullying but more the teachers aren't really trying to help me. Ever since my dad did that, I have been more forceful on things. Being civil and complacent only makes people think less of it. My family are pretty hard on my dad. He left us for another woman and they constantly call him a bad dad. But I think he is a great dad. He has pretty bad money problems, but when it comes to taking care of us, he tries his best, and I think that is what matters most. TLDR, after 1 to 2 years of teachers doing nothing to help, my dad kicks their butt into gear in an afternoon and solves my bullying. When I was a teenager, me and my sister used to smoke weed together. Our dad knew we both smoked, but had never smoked with us, and our mom sort of knew that we smoked weed, but didn't approve of it. She doesn't smoke weed, cigarettes or drink, while my dad does all three. Anyway, back to the story. Okay, so our dad comes home and me and my sister were both just chilling, and my dad asks if I wanted to smoke a joint in the bathroom, since my mom was upstairs in her room asleep or watching TV. I said yeah sure. We get in the bathroom and says I should go get my sister, and I'm like really? Okay, and go get her. Telling her that our dad wants to smoke a joint with us, which was weird but fun at the same time, since the three of us hadn't ever smoked together. So the three of us are sitting in the bathroom smoking a joint, and suddenly there's a knock at the door, which wasn't locked. So my mom just walks in and starts yelling at me and my sister, "I don't want you smoking pot in the house. What the hell do you think you're doing?" etc. Just generally giving us shit, all the while our dad is just hiding right behind the door she is holding open. I'm looking right at her with red glazed eyes, trying my best not to look at my dad and laugh as he's just huddled up behind it like something out of a cheesy sitcom or movie bit, hiding from his wife holding a still burning joint. She pushes it a bit more open and realizes there's something behind it and looks. Holy fuck, was she ever mad? She demanded my sister and I go to our rooms, which we do, and all we can hear for the next while is her yelling at our dad. It was a strange experience, lol. TLDR. Dad smoked a joint with me and my sister. We got busted by our mom and he tried to hide behind the door when she walked into the room. I'm a little late to the party, but one time my dad found a bobsled frame. We used to go out on summer Wednesdays, garbage night, to the nice neighborhoods. He'd be in the driver's seat, me on a telephone book in the passenger's side, both holding cold sweating cans of off-brand cola. It was on such an evening we spied an orange piece of metal sticking out of the trash. I wasn't really sure what it was at first, but when my father said it was a bobsled, I thought that was pretty cool. Granted, my only context for a bobsled was the movie Cool Runnings, which came out the year before, but it was still a neat find. The thing went into our garage, and over the summer Pop found a derelict pair of skis to use as runners, and did a little bit of structural re-engineering on the piece. By the time the winter came around, I had almost forgotten about the thing. That is, until the first snow. For some reason, perhaps because New Jersey opts to cull a certain amount of children, leaving only the strong, a huge sledding hill terminated into a wide rushing river tributary. There was enough space for a child going reasonable toboggan speeds to slow down well before the brush-covered ledge that led to icy water over a rocky riverbed. Even if you lost control and went too far, you little child form could barely part the green growth. Not so for an adult man in a stripped down bobsled danger mobile. Pop had been working on a motorcycle in the garage at that point, an old Honda, and he had the front end of one, with windscreen and headlight. So when the first good snow was supposed to come down, my father went out and attached it to the front of the bobsled. This not only gave it a fair amount of front weight, but he attached a battery so the headlight actually worked. With snow coming down, we pushed the thing onto the trailer and dragged it off to the sledding hill. What we must have looked like dragging this strange contraption to the top of the hill, I don't know, but we got it up to the appropriate position. My mother was extremely skeptical. He gave us a thumbs up and sheet-eating grin and pushed off. Holy crap, did that thing fly? It whizzed down the hill at speeds that put every tobogganer to shame. There's only one thing, he wasn't slowing down, and the end of the hill runoff was rapidly running out. Then, there was no more hill. The bobsled frame rocketed through the brush. It slid, creating a ramp that launched my father up into the air in an elegant arc over the water. Then gravity exerted its pull. My father hit the water with a heavy splash. My mother and I were in shock. Was he alright? We jumped into the toboggan and slid down the hill. I remember thinking it was the only time I've ever wanted a sled ride to be shorter. When we got to the bottom, my father was fine and already dragging the bobsled out of the water to give it another go. However, my mother pointed out that if he went again and died this time, I'd probably starve to death. We have a family business. Dad is a locksmith and a safe cracker, and mom runs a shop and does the books. I guess he saw her point and his back was already a little hurt, so we packed up the bobsled and went home. Pretty great airtime, right kiddo? Said Dad. Yeah, I said. You almost died, said Mom. But it was still pretty great. Admit it. It was great. It goes back into the trash. And so we went home to eat soup, and the bobsled went into the garbage. But that night it disappeared from the pile. Other trash pickers had found it, and the cycle could continue. Godspeed bobsled, wherever you are. TLDR, my father made a garbage bobsled and launched himself into low Earth orbit. Late to the party as usual. Tornadoes are pretty common where I live. While we don't have one every other day, we still have a storm cellar like every other God-fearing southerner. One night, at precisely 2:13 am, the siren, which is located directly across the street and shakes the whole house when it goes off, starts blaring. So my mother and I grab the dogs and run to the storm cellar. Did you wake your dad up? No mom. He's a big boy, he can take care of himself. Tornado sirens are loud affairs. We have the air raid siren across the street, another one about 5 blocks away, and every fire truck and police cruiser our tiny town can spare are driving up and down the town, blaring their own sirens. Scary stuff. Loud stuff. So about 10 minutes goes by, with no sign of my dad. I'm starting to feel bad. What if the finger of God comes down and picks my house up and throws my dad into Oz? Or at the very least, flatten him? So I opened the heavy metal door only to find, well, my dad. He was standing in the middle of the yard in only his boxers, a cup of black coffee in one hand, a cigar hanging from his mouth, and he was pointing a flashlight to heaven as hell rained down around him. The perfect image of nonchalant as the sky crackled with lightning. What the hell are you doing? Just looking for funnel clouds. TLDR, my northerner dad is more southern than I'll ever be. Long-winded but maybe worth it for some. Multiple one-time stories from my dad. I'll try to compress them so you can have a hint at the type of parenting my two brothers and I experienced growing up. One time, but happened quite often on our adventures to North Wales, my dad strapped me and my brothers to the roof of his Land Rover with bungee cords when driving down a forestry commission road. All ended in tears as my dad would drive under low-hanging tress, so we'd go through all the leaves. We thought it was great until an unexpected branch hidden in the leaves took my little brother out and launched him off the back of the Land Rover, bearing in mind he was marginally responsible and kept it under 10 to 15 miles per hour when there were low trees. One time my dad also used to dress up as Mr. Whiteface when we were younger. Mr. Whiteface consisted of him heavily applying shaving foam to his face in a manner of which was utterly terrifying. My dad used to be an artist, so the way he molded and shaped the shaving foam on his face allowed his appearance to look very gaunt, have a foot-long pointy chin and deep dark eye sockets, It was horrifying to say the least at a young age and very convincing. Whenever he thought we were catching on to Mr. Whiteface being him, he would stage scenarios to cast suspicion elsewhere. For instance, when staying in a cottage once, he took a photograph of us all in front of said cottage, the camera being on a timer, and to our terror Mr. Whiteface was in the top window. We later discovered the motherfucker, literally, had brought a mannequin's head with us on holiday and staged this to maintain the illusion Mr. Whiteface was real. He hasn't just terrified my brothers and me either. He has exposed my childhood friends to this, which led to my family being locked out of our house for 3 hours because he decided it was a good idea to climb on top of the shed when we were having a BBQ as Mr. Whiteface do this weird screech/growl at everyone sat around the fire, then sprint and leap off the end of the shed towards the bushes, disappearing into the dark. 2 of my friends ran in the house and locked the doors. The others screamed and ran out the back gate and home. A lot of parents rang up afterwards, and one kid went into shock as well as sheeting his pants. The theatrical extent my dad went to in order to terrify us was honestly outstanding. There was also the wooden board tied with rope to the back of the Land Rover and dragging us round a cow sheet infested field. Every time he turned, one of us would be thrown from the board and through multiple cow paths. Required a heavy hose down in a field later on that day. It's impossible to pick just one, so I'll give a bonus at the end. One time my dad got a cease and desist letter from the eyes. My dad ran a computer consulting firm from a home office in the 1970s and was audited 1 year. He cooperated, but the eyes wasn't happy with the records he brought in. He said he'd see what other receipts he could find. Over the next several months, he sent them a bunch of packages all addressed properly with his case number and all containing a few receipts. Eventually, he just sort of overwhelmed the agent who was in charge of auditing him, I guess, and they sent him a letter asking him to stop sending receipts. In response, he sent another package with several more receipts along with a letter asking about the status of his audit. They responded that his case had been dropped. One time my dad decided to represent me in a felony traffic court case and won. When I was 17, I got a speeding ticket. This was a speed trap in Scottsdale, Arizona, put in one day on a road that I drove every day on the way home from school. They dropped a 25 miles per hour sign in where some new homes were just starting to be built. The speed limit before that day was 45, so I was going faster than 25. The cop that waved me over said I was going 58, making it a felony speeding ticket. I had just moved to Arizona from Washington, and our truck had broken down in Portland, so we had purchased the El Camino in Oregon. That made the officer's day and he threw in out-of-state license and plate tickets for good measure. The date of the court case came, and I dressed in a suit. My dad was dressed in an old t-shirt and jeans with white paint stains on them. I asked him if he was going to change. No, this is fine. When my case came up, my dad asked if he could represent me because I was a minor. The prosecutor objected because the speeding ticket was a felony as I was driving more than twice the speed limit. The judge said he could advise me, but not represent me. In response, my father reached down and turned on the microphone that was right in front of him, ensuring that every whisper he made was audible to everyone in the courtroom. The prosecutor had a map drawn on a whiteboard as an exhibit and asked his first witness, Cop A, the one who had written the ticket, to explain what had gone on. He testified that I turned the corner and passed the speed limit sign and was captured by Cop B on radar at a speed of 58 miles per hour. Cop B then flagged me over and Cop A asked for my license and registration. After noticing they were both out of state, he asked me several questions. During our conversation, it became obvious that Mr. Bennick had lived in the state longer than 3 months, long enough to obtain an Arizona driver's license and registration, so I added those citations to the speeding violation. It was my turn. I had no idea what to do. Dad leans in and guided me through some basics. First of all, this guy doesn't remember if you were driving a white Volkswagen or a red Ford Mustang. Cop A was on the stand looking at the prosecutor and Cop B was flipping through his notebook confused. Ask if he remembers what kind of car you were driving and ask him why he mentioned the 20 other cars they had pulled over. Cop A couldn't answer the make and model of the car. He didn't have the ticket in front of him. He said he didn't think there were 20 cars pulled over. I mentioned that by the time he got around to writing my tickets, that was how many I counted. The judge actually laughed. Dad leaned over and whispered, "Ask the judge if I can ask him some questions." I did, and she agreed. I can't remember what he asked. I think he asked general things like if he was married. I know the prosecutor objected, and the judge asked my dad where he was going with his questioning. Just a few more questions and I think you'll see my point here, Your Honor. So, are you a basketball fan? Cop A. Yeah. How long have I lived in Arizona? What? Well, you said that after your brief conversation with my son you could tell that he had lived in Arizona for longer than 3 months. We've been talking for at least twice as long as you talked with my son during that traffic stop, so you should be able to tell how long I've lived here. When Cop B got on the stand, he agreed with our version of events almost exactly. When it was our turn to question him, Dad leaned in and said, "We don't need to ask him anything. He already said everything we need him to." He stepped down looking more confused than the first cop. When our time came to present, I explained things as well as I could, and I just said, "Dad, could you tell us what you know?" He walked up to the whiteboard and asked the judge if she minded some corrections. She said no, so he basically erased half of the board, moving the speed limit signs, erasing 2 houses completely, marking 2 as frames only, and marking the areas where the road was still unpaved. After that, he explained all of his corrections. First of all, I wasn't there when my son was pulled over. I did however stop by on my way home from work and check the location out. I have also driven the route several times both before and after, so I'm familiar with what was there before the day in question, and after. It seems, based on the diagram the prosecutor and officers presented here, that I'm more familiar with it than they are. I have no doubt that my son was speeding. He's 17, and he was on a road that one day had a speed limit of 45 and suddenly was changed to 25, so the city could run a speed trap and make a little money. Now I know that the change was officially made because new houses were going up. The problem is that none of those houses were even completed when Sean got pulled over. Now as of last Friday, 2 of those houses are completed and 1 is occupied. The street is also fully paved. When the prosecutor questioned him, things got interesting. "Mr. Bennick, were you there when your son was pulled over?" "No." "So when Cop A was questioning your son and trying to determine how long he had lived in the state you weren't there?" "No, I wasn't there. If you were paying attention when I just spoke you would have heard that." "So is it possible that he could have asked your son a question about how long he had lived in the state during that conversation?" "He did ask, and Sean told him." At the end of the case, the judge dismissed the out-of-state license, and Plaidson said she would be looking into the positioning of the signs before making a decision. I asked Dad what that meant. He flipped the microphone off and whispered, "It means we won." We stuck around for a few minutes, but I didn't understand why. As she stood up, the judge looked at the prosecutor and just said, "In my office, now." My son always wants to hear this one, because it's so funny to him, so I guess it's the best one. My parents bought an old home when I was 4, so that we'd have room for my new sister. It's an old house, built in the late 1800s, and so it's needed a lot of fixing up over the years. Most of the renovations were done while I was a child, which helped me learn a lot about home repairs and improvement. The house had a thick, nearly shag, rust-colored carpet through much of the ground floor, which went up the stairs to the second floor and through the upstairs hallway. My parents pulled it all out when I was around 9 years old and set about replacing the flooring. The ground floor has been a revolving door of linoleum, tile, and hardwood over the years, but the carpet they installed in the upstairs hallway and down the stairs has remained. Cutting and fitting the carpet to the hallway and stairs was quite a chore, as it is one continuous piece. They did the hallway portion first, and then moved on to the stairs, with the carpet running and folding over each stair. I always helped my parents with their home improvements, and still do today. When it came time to do the stairs, my parents had some discussion about how to ensure they cut it to the correct length before affixing it to the stairway. This was the last part of a difficult job for them, and so the urge to wrap it up and get it done was pretty prevalent. We were standing at the top of the stairs when this discussion was happening, with the carpet rolled down them. The carpet laid straight out down the stairs, hiding the stairs, resembling a ramp or a slide. In my young mind, the easiest way to do this was pretty obvious. I suggested to my dad that he should sit on the top of the stairway and scoot down each step on his butt. I reasoned that the weight of him sitting on the carpet would make it move into place and fold over each step as he descended. It made sense to me, and to him as well. I don't recall if my mom was on board, but she's a naysayer, so it's a safe bet that she wasn't as confident about the plan as he and I were. So, my dad sat down at the top of the stairs and scooted down the first step. Instead of the carpet giving way to his body weight, gravity held hands with its good friend inertia, and together gave him a swift slide down the entire stairway, straight into the wall at the bottom. There were mild obscenities intermixed with the thuds of him descending the stairs and hitting the wall, but luckily this was one of the jobs that didn't result in anything close to serious injury. We all had a good laugh over it, but my input on how to do things was met with appropriate scrutiny for many years after. I have a lot of terrific childhood memories because of that man, and he continues to be an inspiration to me to this day. I'm lucky enough to still have him around, and we are heading out today with my own son for a weekend of camping over the holiday weekend. I'm almost certain my son will ask him to tell this story again at some point during our trip. One time my dad beat up a bad guy at the end of Rocky. I was about 10 years old. Me, my dad and my mum went to see Rocky Balboa in the cinema late one night. Throughout the whole movie there were these two reprobates in hoods getting up and leaving the cinema, then coming back a couple minutes later. They were talking and milling about throughout the whole film. I got up to go to the toilet myself. I was bored out of my skull. My parents noticed one of them follow me out of the cinema. One of the guys came into the bathroom after me, and pretty much immediately my dad came in as well. I remember being confused about my dad coming in because he didn't have to go. I ignored it, and we went back to watch the finale of the film. I was finally enjoying the film. Rocky was fighting the guy. He was forgettable, I can't remember his name. All of a sudden one of the reprobates shouted, "Let it RIP," and he sprayed the entire audience with a fire extinguisher. I got hit with a little bit of it, but the front got more wet than us. My dad gets up, runs over to the guy while he's spraying the fire extinguisher, and puts him into a full Nelson. I'm told his pal was going to try help his buddy holding the fire extinguisher, but another guy in the audience stood up and successfully intimidated the other reprobate. The police were on their way and my dad restrained the guy while we waited on them. While he's restraining the reprobate, the finale to Rocky Balboa is playing behind him, and the rest of the theater are cheering my dad and shouting, "Rocky, Rocky, Rocky." At the time I was terrified, but after it happened I was forever telling everyone in school about the time he beat up a bad guy at the end of Rocky. My dad appeared in court to give evidence against the reprobates, and he was convicted with something or other. TLDR, went to see Rocky Balboa at night when I was a kid with mum and dad. Ned sprayed fire extinguisher on audience. Dad restrained him during the climax of the film and the whole audience cheered for him by shouting, "Rocky, Rocky, Rocky." One time my dad bought a ham for some amount of money, let's say $10. As he gets home, he sees the price tag which says the ham weighed 2 pounds and cost $8. This did not sit right with him. So he goes downstairs, comes back with a faking triple beam balance like the ones from middle school science classes. And this thing appears to be older than I am. So he starts to weigh the ham, but realizes that the ham weighs more than the balance can measure. So he goes back downstairs to find some kind of weighted addition to increase what the balance can measure, because of course he owns not just a goddamn triple beam balance, but additions for his triple beam balance. Turns out he can't find them anywhere, so he figures he'll just add some arbitrary weights on the end to serve the same purpose. Problem is, you need to calculate both how much the counterweight weighs and also how far from the fulcrum of the lever it is to determine how much it affects the final readout. So he starts weighing and measuring and plugging things into algebraic equations, all to weigh this faking ham, so he can see if he paid $2 too much for it. It takes him an entire hour to finally get an answer, and he determines that the price tag was wrong about the weight. The ham ended up being a little more than 2 pounds. So he's looking all over, thinking that maybe the tags got switched or something, on and on and on. Anyway, my mom comes downstairs, looks at the tag for 10 seconds, and says, "That's the unit price. The ham is $8 for every £2. Genius." I have never let my super nerdy dad ever live down his hour-long triple beam balance escapade. One time, after my then boyfriend and I got into a really bad accident, my dad circled the parking lot going, "Ooh, a penny. Ooh, a dime. Ooh, another penny," while my mom and my then BS parents talked about what happened. Then, my dad walks up to all of us and goes, "If you see a penny on the ground and you don't pick it up, you'll always be a penny down for the rest of your life." One time, my dad was using a chainsaw to cut tree limbs. He got up onto the very top of the ladder, onto the part that said, "Do not step here," and went to work. He fell off of the ladder, square onto his back. He managed to throw the chainsaw away from him while he was falling, so miraculously, it didn't kill him. The neighbors, who have known us for years, rushed over to assist my dad, who'd had the wind knocked out of him. As they fawned and fussed over him, my father, struggling to breathe, manages to gasp out, "Please, don't tell my wife." One time, my dad lost his finger to a tire machine. Now, when he's building things with friends, and there's a new guy, he makes sure to slam a hammer down onto the empty space in the glove and scream. I could go on forever. One time, my dad pulled a hamstring doing spin kicks in the living room while watching MMA fighting on TV. He is not an MMA fighter, he is a software architect. One time my dad asked me if I wanted to go for a ride, so we head out and we start to leave our town in the direction of the bigger town about 15 to 20 minutes away. I get curious and think this might be a more interesting trip than I was expecting. I was like 12-year-old and loved the most trivial things, even just going to the store and window shopping, which is why he would actually leave me behind for Walmart trips a lot. So excitedly I ask the whole way, "Where are we going?" He just smiles and keeps driving, dodging the question. We are coming up to the intersection for Walmart, but he is in the opposite turning lane. This turning lane lead to exactly 3 things at the time: a car wash, storage units, and a movie theater. So I'm basically losing my shit at this point. We didn't go to the movies too often, and I had only been anticipating a nice trip to the Walmart. We pull into the theater. It's noon-ish and the lot is near empty. We park near the entrance. I've got a big smile on my face as we are walking up to the entrance and ticket booth, but he skips the ticket booth going straight for the doors. Now this was before online tickets and buying your tickets at the concession, but I was excited and played it off he wanted to get concessions first or something. No big deal. We are at concessions now. He orders a ricey and asks what flavor I want, so I tell him. We get them, pay, and we start walking outside to our car. I get this sinking feeling, my 12-year-old brain trying to rationalize a valid reason why we would need to go back to the car. While I'm pondering, he gets in and motions for me to do the same. Then he just starts the car and drives away. TLDR, my dad excites me with a trip to the movie theater a town over from our own, only to buy ices and leave. That man really loved 2 things a lot: ices and playing jokes on me. Probably too late for this. In 11th grade, I was 16. One week, my mom went on vacation with one of our 2 family vehicles. One evening during that week, I went to hang out with my friends using the other family vehicle. This left my dad home alone without means of transportation. I got home that night at around 9:45 to 10 o'clock, and he was pissed. Not at me, but breathing heavily and outraged. He proceeded to tell me what happened. He was watching television, and he heard a loud bang outside. He didn't think much of it, but less than a minute later he heard another bang. When he got up to look out the front door, he saw a car full of kids going down our street leveling all of the mailboxes. Our mailbox was in the middle of our yard. The first bang. The second bang was our neighbor's. My dad wasn't wearing anything but his underwear. He originally just planned on calling the police when he saw the car turn left a few houses down onto what they thought was a road, but it was not a road, it was a cul-de-sac. At this point, his plan changed from notifying the authorities to vigilantism. You see, since they turned into the cul-de-sac, they were more than likely going to level all of those mailboxes and turn out to come back the way they came, leaving a block devastated by their baseball bats. It was just a whim, but that is what my dad believed was going to happen. So he quickly, with no pants on or shoes, ran out the front door and picked up our mailbox, carrying it quickly down the street to catch the wrong dollars. As he ran toward the cul-de-sac, a mere 5 houses away from us, he said he heard the banging and laughter, and then, just as he suspected, they pulled out coming in his direction. The headlights landed on him, a grown man in his underwear holding a mailbox. They came to a dead stop. He threw the mailbox and it cracked their windshield. He yelled something, he didn't remember what, because of the adrenaline. The kids threw that car into reverse, peeled out, and made an escape. I'm sitting here in disbelief as he tells me all this. He was mainly upset that he didn't have a vehicle to chase them in, which is understood. When he told me the car was a white Dodge Shadow, I couldn't believe it. I worked with a douche at the local record store, and he drove a white Dodge Shadow. I knew where he lived, and my dad immediately said, "Get in the car. Let me put some pants on." The Shadow was there, and it had a cracked windshield. The dude never copped up to it until I saw him like 10 years later at Walmart. He just laughed and said, "Your dad is insane, man." One time, my dad had me help get his truck out of a stall, and I ended up driving for the first time, really badly. I was 7 years old, pretty big for my age, and we'd gone to the store in the evening. My dad was still using the small Toyota that he'd picked up years ago to get to and from work, and it's the mid-80s. Well, the truck would stall a lot, so he needed to push start it, and told me to hop in the driver's seat and push this pedal then pedal. Got it? Well, I didn't get it, cause he started pushing the truck and I must have hopped on the gas. Next thing I see is my dad running behind the truck, flailing his arms telling me to hit the brake, but I didn't know which one was the bear. I rocket off in the parking lot of this store, down a line of parked cars swerving violently to avoid hitting any of them, and then cut a turn through a massive pine tree, sheared the branches off on one side, and they never did grow back, clipped some shopping carts, and then just curled up in a ball wanting it all to stop letting the truck coast towards a bank that was on the other side of the parking lot. My father finally caught up to the truck, panting away and told me to get over. He stops the truck, chuckles, asks if we are okay. It's only then that I look in the back seat, where my little brother is curled up in fear and hiding behind the seat. He didn't want back in that truck for weeks. Last thing my dad said, "Oh, don't tell mom, okay?" My dad lost his eye in an accident when he was 15. As a result, he's had a glass eye his entire adult life. On many occasions, he's pulled it out just to gross people out, especially younger family members. Very rarely did he ever pull it out around people he didn't know, let alone tell people he had a glass eye. Except one time. It was about 11 PM and we were coming home from some event. There was a Walgreens about a half-mile from where we lived, and we needed a small item from there. We figured it was closed, but since it was on the way home anyways, we pulled into the parking lot to check. Alas, it was closed, but my dad told me to get out and check the hours, because he couldn't remember if they closed at 10 PM or 11 PM. He pulled into the space next to the door, which happened to be a disabled parking spot. I got out of the car, looked at the door, and started to get back in the car. As I closed the door, somebody else pulls up, right next to the driver's side of our vehicle. It was a guy in his 50s, drunk, with a woman in the passenger seat of this lifted diesel F350. That spot's for the disabled, you asshole. Move your car, my dad proceeded, by rolling down his window, removing his glass eye, holding it up for all to see, and responding with, "Who's the real asshole here, you prick?" The guy said, "I'm so sorry man, holy shit," and peeled off. My mom and I were laughing our ass off. Forgot what the hours of the store were, because I was laughing so hard. One time my dad picked up a hitchhiker. I was about 8 at the time. The hitchhiker looked hardened and rough around the edges, but seemed like a nice enough guy. The stranger threw his duffel bag in the truck bed, and we head off. About 5 minutes down the road my dad looked out the rearview mirror and saw the guy's bag moving in an odd way. Dad casually asked him what he was toting in the bag. The stranger replies, "None of your damn business." This caught both my dad and I off guard. Dad ignores the guy's attitude and we drive on in silence. A few more miles down the road the bag moves again and it catches my father's eye. My dad asked again, but this time more directly, "What you got in the bag? It's moving weirdly." The hitchhiker replied, "None of your damn business." The stranger's response caught my dad even more off guard this time because he directly addressed something moving in the bag. My dad asked that the stranger watch his language because he had a small child in the truck. Again my dad decided to ignore the rudeness and continue down the road in silence. A few moments later my dad and I both see the bag move in an odd way once again. So my dad asked a stranger again, "Sorry man, I really have to know what's in the bag. I just want to make sure we're being safe." The stranger turned his head and looked at my dad and says once again, "None of your damn business." At this point my dad is fed up and pulls the truck over. He tells the hitchhiker, "I'm really sorry to have to do this, but I'm going to have to pull over and ask you to get out of the truck." So my dad pulls the truck over on the side of the highway and asks a stranger to get out. My dad then proceeds to drive away without allowing a stranger to get his bag out of the back of the truck. We had a good laugh. My dad is a crazy Chinese man, so have I got some stories for you. When he was 18, he wanted to become a pirate and go to Burma. He gathered a small militia and made it to the port of Taipei before my grandfather, who was part of the Republic of China's Air Force, got to him. Said this was the first time my grandpa beat him to within an inch of his life. After that, he got sent to America for an education, because that was clearly how you dealt with your child who wants to become a pirate, got an MBA, and opened a computer company. His conquering heart is still strong though, and has beaten all the versions of 104 at least twice. My parents have a farm in Costa Rica, and they have farm dogs. One day the alpha female and the alpha male were fighting, and my dad decided to try separating them by hand. Bad idea, got his face ripped open. Went to the hospital, and sewed it up, but he has a large semicircular scar running from his lip to his cheek. When he came back, and we all had a family dinner with my uncle and his wife, my uncle asked him what happened and he said, dead serious, he got into a fight with a jaguar and won. My mom didn't correct him, and to this day, my uncle believes that's what happened. At the same farm, they got robbed when they were sleeping one night, took their firearms, so it was a good thing they didn't wake up. So my dad went nuts with the security and built some electric fencing around the house. One night, they heard the dogs barking, and when they came out, the dogs had surrounded a huge rattlesnake. My dad goes inside and gets this metal snake clamp thing, specifically designed to grab snakes, which is a common occurrence there, and he picks it up. As he's about to cross the fence, he stops and my sister and my mom both see the gears turning in his head and start yelling at him to just put the snake outside the fence because he was considering electrocuting it while holding it with a metal snake holder. After he gets screamed at by two hysterical females for another couple of minutes, he lets it go, but is very annoyed. Says he just wanted to teach it a lesson, so it won't come back. Like snakes totally understand that. He also has a terrible sense of humor. One day my mom was telling me how she's glad my grandma did beat a lot of morality into her, and she never became like some other girls who came to America and became strippers or hostesses at bars. My dad walks into the kitchen exactly at that moment, and without skipping a beat, says, "Maybe we would have met sooner if you did." So mortifying. Can't narrow it down to one time. One time we went out to eat with my parents, and on our way out, my dad stopped to say to another older couple, "My grandson is cuter than your grandson." And then he laughed and walked away. One time when I was enormously pregnant we were visiting with my dad, and he was showing us his new drone. He was controlling it while it flew around his cul-de-sac, and then thought it would be funny to fly it down really low near my head to freak me out. Well, it worked. I screamed and turned around to run away, and tripped face first on the driveway. It wasn't serious enough to cause damage to our baby, but he does walk kinda funny sometimes. One evening my dad was using a chainsaw to cut some logs, and since he was losing daylight, he was also losing visibility. He ended up chainsawing his leg, knocking the bone. On the way to the He passed out in the passenger seat and started snoring really loudly. He ended up needing surgery to have a muscle removed from his thigh to cover the wound. One time while we were at Disney World, my dad was pushing my stepmom in a wheelchair. She has manuscript. As he came up on a hill, he thought it would be funny to let go of the handles, so it went flying down the hill into a curb, sending her airborne into a patch of grass. One time when we were moving, my dad packed a box and wrote Chester drawers on the side. He really thought that's what it was called. Never a dull moment. Probably late to this show, but here's my dad's story. So one time, when I was home, my dad and I headed out to Lowe's to get some stuff. We stop and get gas. He subsequently leaves his wallet on the trunk of his car and drives off. We get all the way up there, get the stuff, and his wallet is gone. No biggie, I buy the stuff and we move on with the day hunting his wallet. We go back to square one and beyond. No luck. Next morning I wake up and hear him downstairs with my stepmom calling all the credit card companies to cancel his cards and organizing to get him a new license, etc. When the phone rings and it's a guy saying he's found his wallet, my dad is really grateful to the person on the phone. So I come on downstairs and he's like, "We are gonna go get my wallet." My dad is super genuine and very kind to any stranger he meets. So the first thing he does is tells me to drive to an ATM to get some money. He pulls out a $100 to give to the guy. Little side note, he reminded me to grab his pistol just in case this was an attempted robbery or whatever. So I do, of course. Guys tells us where to meet. It's not too sketchy, but you wouldn't catch me in this area after dark. This was at like noon meeting him. We get there and this very large black man steps out of his car. My dad and I are very fit white men, corn-fed boys. Guys give my dad his wallet and said he found it at the gas station. My dad grabs it, no questions asked, and hands the money, shaking his hand. Guy politely refuses. My dad insists and tell him, "Take this and get you and your family some watermelon, fried chicken, or whatever you want." The guy's face changes immediately and I grab the pistol, out of sight of course. My dad just casually walks back to the truck. Dude is standing there in near disbelief. We get in the truck and I pretty much hightail it out of there. Halfway home I ask my dad, who does not have a racist bone in his body, "Do you realize what you said to the guy?" My dad, seriously confused, says, "No, what do you mean?" I said, "You told a black man from the south to get himself and his family some watermelon and fried chicken." My dad's face went very stern and he said, "It's 4th of July. Everyone eats watermelon and fried chicken down here." It was the 4th of July and my dad just wanted to cover the cost of a party for the guys, being cordial enough to return the wallet. When I was younger, my family lived in SoCal. In 1994 there was a big earthquake and several aftershocks, and everyone was on high alert. The way our house was set up, to get to the earthquake safe zone, my sis and I would have to run through the living room. In the living room was this awful tacky, giant entertainment center 7 feet tall by 9 feet long, glass doors with gold knobs and black accents. 90s equals no accounting for taste. There were many plans about us kids running through an earthquake, past this monstrosity to safety. One night, 2 AM or so, earthquake wakes everyone up. My mom runs into our room and we all head into the living room. My dad was standing in front of the entertainment center holding it in place so we could run to safety as the whole house is violently shaking. Turns out my dad sleeps naked and they really hadn't prepped for nighttime earthquakes. So as us girls are running across the living room, we see our poor dad trying to hold that thing up to the wall, stark naked. Let's just say some jiggling was going on. He kept yelling, "Avert your eyes, girls. Avert your eyes." We had no idea what the fuck he was talking about, so we kept trying to close our eyes as my mom literally drags us past him. Our family was made for the Benny Hill soundtrack. This is absolutely going to get buried because I'm late to the party, but it was the funniest moment of my life. My parents don't drink. I think aside from this story, my father has had 3 beers in my 33 years on this planet. When I was about 16, my sister and I would hang out with my parents in their bedroom because my dad would play his video games in there on their TV, so it wasn't a weird occurrence for us all to be shoved into their tiny room in various forms of lounging. We had a cat named Old Time, whom my father named, that was just an asshole. Mean old crotchety cat, but damn did that thing love my dad. Apparently, after a particularly hard day at work, my father stopped and picked up a 6-pack of Killian's Red and decided that he was going to drink all of them within a half hour. I didn't say he's smart. He has the alcohol tolerance of an atsfatched. Obviously, he gets smashed. And not just bust. Completely sheet-faced. Now, let me describe my father's physique. He's about 5 feet 7 inches, I'm being generous, barrel-chested, and perpetually looks 7 months pregnant with his big ol' belly, glasses, and a haircut that would put Steve Perry's beautiful latest style side wings to shame. Dorcas Maximus. He strips down to his today white ties and robe, his mismatched tube socks, and crawls out of his room on all fours with his pasty white ass in the air. Oh yeah, they were definitely streaked underwear. Gag, and saw the cat in the hallway. The cat is meowing and crawling under his, and doing cat things. He starts asking the cat questions that the cat can't faking answer because it doesn't speak human. My father, bless his faking heart, gets super aggravated that there is no communication with this animal, sits up on his legs, flips the cat off, and yells "fuck you cat." He then promptly falls over and passes out in the hallway, in his underwear and socks. My sister and I peed our pants laughing. Mom didn't find it as funny as we did. She did however laugh hysterically as he threw up into the toilet and made sounds that rivaled a large walrus being gang raped by a polar bear. He will never live it down. We bring it up every time he has a beer. It is our legacy. I love my father. One time my dad fell off some scaffolding at work and threw out his arms reflexively to break his fall. He ended up spraining both of his wrists and ripping the seat of his pants. Sadly my dad never wore underwear and was mortified when some guy who'd seen him fall ran over to help and got a knife full of my dad's balls lol. One time my dad put this big fake plant in bed with my mom. He put it on his side of the bed then proceeded to pull the covers over it, almost like he was sneaking out. She woke up when some of the leaves started poking her and was like what the fuck. Next morning we found dad asleep on the couch, the oven left on, and her jewelry box in the fridge. He still denies that it was him. One time my dad crashed my brother's new dirt bike. He was 12 to 13 years old and my dad told him he was going to give him some pointers on some safety tips before he'd let my brother ride it. There was a big sloping field by our house, so he went there to do his demonstration and then went mobbing down the hill, hitting various sage bushes, and finally ate crap in the dirt at the bottom. Then he came back up the hill to my exasperated mother and brother and said and that's how it's done. One time we were looking through old envelopes of photos from some family trips that never made it into our albums. We were looking through one that had pictures from a trip we took to Six Flags and the nearby zoo etc. And in the middle of the photos was a picture of my dad but naked, looking all pissed off, taking a dump on the hotel toilet. He immediately was like what the hell? I told you to get rid of that. And my mom laughed her ass off. One time I heard my dad complaining that my mom was a selfish lover and that she just treats him like a sex slave. Gross. Thanks dad. One time my dad picked me up from school in our family van, covered in skateboarding stickers, wearing a Budweiser t-shirt and bandana, while the song California Love by Tupac blared. He is white and still looks like he's living in the 80s. I started having him drop me off down the block. One time my dad came to my bedroom looking for the cordless phone. I was probably 14 to 15 at the time. I had a bunch of candles lit and some music playing and was just sitting there reading a book when he bursts in and starts saying, "Do you have the phone? Are you having a seance?" When I said no, he continued to tell me I better not be doing no satanist black magic shit in his house lol. Let me begin by giving some background information on my father. After he divorced my mother he found a condo to live in near our house. He wanted to be around for us, my brother and I, and made sure he had a place for us to stay. It was always fun staying with my dad, since he let me eat chips and hostess cakes all day. I never really had a bedtime and I could watch cable TV which I could not do at my mother's. My father is intelligent when it comes to academics, but not so much when it comes to practical / obvious life skills. 4 years until my father remarried he had a jar of Taco Bell hot sauce stored in the pantry. I only wish that jar still existed as a record of the evolution of Taco Bell hot sauces over a decade. My father also decided that keeping phone books in the oven was appropriate since we only use the microwave on occasion for tea-point-v dinners, and well, why not, right? Well, this one time my dad wanted to heat up some leftovers in the microwave. So he took out the leftovers and placed them on a seemingly microwave safe plate. We watched as he did this and then realized something wasn't right. The outer edge of the plate was gold rimmed. I'm still not entirely sure if the rim was real gold or not, but after being a reckless child and experimenting with batteries in a microwave, I knew metal in microwaves was a bad idea. My brother and I told our dad it was a bad idea and he vehemently believed we were wrong. We pleaded with him and told him that you couldn't put the plate in the microwave. He did. And he started the microwave. Sparks began flying and popping everywhere as he frantically pulled the microwave door open. He placed the plate on the counter, cold food and all, shrugged and sighed, since he had been bested by his children. Sometimes he believes us nowadays. More often than not he would rather put metal in a microwave. To this day I question a lot of my dad's decisions, because that one time my dad put a metal rimmed plate in a microwave. Late to the game, but this is one of my favorite dad stories. One time my dad chased a bear through the forest in his underwear brandishing a handgun and survived. Let me explain. My dad and his 3 buddies all went in on a cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that's in the middle of nowhere, only accessible by what one could loosely call a 25-mile long bike path. They built it and used it as a hunting lodge, but we used to go up a lot when I was small. So I always thought it was a family cabin, not one where you go to shoot things and get drunk with the guys. So one summer I'm 13 and my dad decides that we are going up to spend a couple days with nature, just the 2 of us, and we head up to the cabin with a cooler full of cabin food, hot dogs, Pop-Tarts, pickles, etc. I loathe hot dogs and protested, but we needed to bring things we could make on a fire because there was no stove, so hot dogs it was. We kept the cooler on the side porch because there wasn't a lot of room. Middle of the second night we both wake up to a crash and he grabs a very large, very not used for hunting animals gun from under his bunk and runs out the door in his underwear like a total faking champion. I hear him swearing loudly and running around, and before I can summon the courage to move he returns with the cooler and gun and tells me to shut all the doors and windows. Turns out a bear had stolen the cooler off the porch and was dragging it with his teeth by the handle down the path. My dad had made a sort of boogity-boo gesture at it and he ran off. It then came back and circled the cabin for about 4 hours trying to find a way in. We named the bear Boo Boo because he had stolen our picnic basket. He did me a solid actually, since when we opened it the next day the hot dogs were missing. One day, I found my dad camping outside the bathroom. I could hear the water running, so I knew my mother was inside taking a shower. My dad was giggling like mad, and he was holding something small and black in his hand. I asked him what he was doing on his knees outside of the bathroom. "You lassie," he said. So I placed my 8-year-old butt next to him and waited. The sound of water stops. I hear the door of the shower open. Then my dad starts pressing the thing in his hand with the biggest evil grin on his face. 3 seconds later my mother is screaming. She probably broke the record of screaming loudly. I'm sure my grandma who lived a few streets away could hear. She is screaming for God. She is screaming for dad. She is screaming for help. She is screaming like someone is trying to kill her. And my dad is sitting on the floor, laughing. I threw the door open and see my mother standing on the toilet seat, white in the face, and pointing on the floor. My mother is deathly afraid of spiders. There is a huge moth, a faking spider on the bathroom floor. I mean huge. Like my palm. Now I freak out and back away. My mother is screaming for me not to leave her. "Kill it," she screams. My dad is rolling on the floor laughing. My dad found a toy spider who could do a little jump forward if you pressed a little button. He bought it and scared my mom. He slept on the couch for a few days after that. Geez, hard to pick which one. He's a real colorful guy. My dad has run into the backyard in his boxers and socks to throw rocks at an annoying bird on the shed because it was his day off and he wanted to sleep in. He runs around town He loves to exercise with a weight backpack that is equipped to, and does, carry a pillow-sized American flag. He's a veteran who loves running and his country. One time he was late to pick me up from the train station because he witnessed a pretty bad car accident and stopped. Ended up being the first responder and saved a young military guy's life. Dash was in his lap. He'd hit the tail end of a semi. Also he is an LPN, so he was qualified to help. He once carried my swing set about 5 blocks down the street by standing under it, then lifting it with both hands above his head because we moved house and he didn't want to disassemble it and load it onto a truck. Also drove the riding mower about a mile another time we moved for the same reason. He was once putting up Christmas lights on our 2-story house. We heard him yell from inside and found him flat on his back in the driveway. Yeah, he fell and got up and walked away unharmed. He blew a disc a few years later dropping a gurney. Weirdest luck ever. He played amateur hockey for a while as a goalie, got too many concussions, so he switched to a different position. Doctor told him he needed to quit after 2 more concussions. Became a coach. Took a puck to the face while standing on the bench during a game. Another concussion. One time, I forgot my house key in high school, so I tried to use the dog door. We have a Shih Tzu, so I ended up with a gun in my face and Mars stuck in the dog door. He's smart enough to ask questions first, so it quickly became resolved that I'd use the garage door from then on. Overall, he's quite the character, but definitely the best dad I've ever met, and a really intelligent and funny guy. His weirdly shitty luck makes for some great stories, though. I've been waiting for this moment. One time I was on my way home from a girl's house who didn't smoke, on my way to a friend's house where we going to smoke heavily. I say this because safe to say, I was speeding like crazy and blasting music as I was very excited. I ended up bridging about 105 or 110 miles per hour, no other cars around me on a well-lit 5-lane road, before I bridged a hill and saw another car at the bottom about a half mile away. I started braking, and when I got next to the car, a cop pulled me over. He only caught me going 72 in a 40, although it was a mandatory court date. I called my dad immediately, and he wasn't too pissed because I hadn't had a ticket or accident before. We find out the court date a couple days later and put it off our minds until then. So the day comes I have to go court in Indiana, in the county where the justice system is notoriously prickish. I'm a white guy, so honestly, I went in with an advantage. My dad and I talked about what I should say on the way there. I kept insisting I told him the truth. I had to pee. I wanted to get to my friends. I knew how fast I was going. Only 70 to remember. There were no cars. He disagreed. He convinced me to say I honestly didn't realize how fast I was going. I walk in the court. We are about 15 minutes early, and we are the one of the first families/persons there, so we meander our way up to the front row. I'm second to go, and I feel lucky because I was so nervous to talk to a judge and was allowed to leave after I did so. So the judge asks me my name and reads over my police report, kind of surprised to see this one connect with me. He says, "Just tell me what happened. This is your first offense, no? Just tell me what was going through your mind." I tell him exactly what my dad said. I honestly didn't know how fast I was going. I swear to God, this judge takes off his reading glasses and looks me directly in the eyes and says, "That's the absolute worst answer you could have given me." I panic. My dad panics 7 or 8 seats away from me. I tell the judge in one swift save of Mars that there were no other cars. When I saw the car I checked my speed and slowed down, and that I had my mind on peeing the girl. Thankfully, he bought it. He told me I could take diversion and there would be no points added if I took a mandatory online driving course. Such young person/white person/no record privilege. Looking back on it, my dad and I promptly scurry TF out of there. The second my dad and I get out of the judge's room, we both almost collapse from our heart rates and blood pressure going off the charts. I look at him, open my mouth, and he just insists immediately with no, not yet. I laugh. We talk to the clerk who is not laughing, and then we walked back to the car. We get in the car, and I'm just like, holy crap. Are you joking? The worst thing I could have said. I thought I was about to go to juvie, Dad. What were you thinking? Have you ever talked to a judge? No, I think that was the first time he responds. Better be the last time. I replied quickly. We went to get something to eat, and now he doesn't even respond when I bring it up. The best part is my yearbook in high school. That year ran a 2-page series of articles about our class's car troubles. I got a full page. TLDR, one time my dad told me what to say to a judge after I got caught going 30+ miles per hour over the speed limit. Almost sent me to juvie with that exact advice, but I somehow managed to get out of it. One time, my dad tried to make me offended by telling me he didn't like anime. As a teenager, I loved anime, still do, and I was obsessed with Yu-Gi-Oh at the time. For some reason, my dad had issues with the Japanese names and would make me change the names to American ones when I talked about them. Note, the names he had issues with were Cabe American Juji, hardly rocket science. Anyway, so one day I was talking to him about a lesson from my English teacher. She was trying to teach the class to think critically of news sources. One example she used was that news stations can be biased depending on who's paying them. Like if a news station is being paid/sponsored by a cigarette company, the station will be less inclined to run negative news about cigarettes. I thought this was a great insight, and I shared it with my dad. I told him I always thought a lot of the news presented felt skewed, and that's why I didn't like it. My dad, and I quote, said the following: "Dad, that's offensive. You need to watch the news." Me, "But they are not telling you the whole story." "Dad, that offends me. You shouldn't say that." "What if I told you I don't like anime?" Me, blank stare because I could give less of a shit. Took him a few minutes to realize I wasn't responding, and I could care less if he disliked anime or not. After that he huffed off and complained to his girlfriend about what I said. I have 3 and it's hard to choose. Me and my little brother were fighting in the driveway for some reason, and he started to throw punches. I look to my dad to berate my brother. My dad just looks at me and says, "Kick his ass, you're bigger." I begin to evade and try to wrestle pin my brother. My bro, at one point, picks up a nearby metal pot for the dog's water bowl and brandishes it as a weapon. My dad then steps in to stop him. My next door neighbor friend is spending the night, and we sneak out to meet up with our respective neighbor girlfriends. They end up at my place and we stupidly watch a movie in the living room. My father is a very heavy sleeper, so I think nothing of it. At one point, my dad comes from his room to go to the kitchen and walks past all of us. My friend's girl hides under his cover, but me and my girl are like deer in headlights. He comes back from the kitchen and then stops at his door and asks, "Is that Brittany?" I respond in the affirmative. He then says she should go home now and closed his door. The next day he asks me if there was any hanky panky, and I told him no. That was the end of that. The final is a time we went field tubing. One time after it rained torrentially, the fields were mine water. My dad's friend got his truck and tied a rope to a tractor tire, and they proceeded to pull my brother, friend, and I behind the truck while we rode the tire. One flip of that tire could have ended us. I've told this before, but it never gets old. This actually came up the day my dad died. My mom, sisters, and I were all sitting around after leaving the hospital and just talking story when we started talking about his love for guns. My dad was an avid fan of all things gun related. He went to the range any chance he got and loved to shoot clay pigeons or watermelon at our cabin out in rural Washington. He even used to make his own shotgun shells in our garage. At one point he had picked up a keychain somewhere that had a hollowed out .22 bullet, and he kept it on his keyring. One family vacation, we were going through security at the airport, and he put his keys in the dish and sent it through the scanner only to have it confiscated. Even though there was no powder or anything in it, it wasn't allowed. Fast forward a few months later, after he had picked up another keychain and was going through airport security, this one was confiscated too. This happened a few too many times before he finally got smart. We were just about to go through security on yet another family trip, yay for grandparents who lived near Disneyland, when my dad realized he still had that bullet on his keyring, and he'd be damned if he was going to lose another one. He didn't have time to run back out to the car, so he looked around. Near the gate was a bunch of decorative plants, So he ran over to one, dropped the keychain in the pot, and walked through security. After the vacation we watched him stroll over to the same potted plant, pluck out his keychain, and walk back to us, jaws dropped to the floor, chuckling the whole time. I miss him every day. Went hiking in an unfamiliar, yet popular, mountainy area with my dad when I was in college. We were hiking up a steep wooded bit with a little symmetrical ridge, maybe 50 feet wide and 15 tall, running straight up the hill parallel to the path we were on. Well, nature called, and my dad needed to take a leak, so he had me watch his back while he walked up to the top of this little ridge and pissed off the other side of it, back facing me and the trail. It was a good long piss, and about midway we suddenly hear voices quickly approaching from right down the hill from us. I'm frantically watching down the trail for people, and don't see anyone as the voices get closer and closer. All of a sudden, I hear a bit of a womanly shriek, and look up to find my dad, looking very surprised, trying to pack up, and come running down the hill, while still doing up his pants. Apparently, we had gotten off on a bit of a secondary trail. The real trail and the one apparently most traveled by large families was immediately on the other side of this ridge, running parallel to the trail we were on. An entire large family with several young teens apparently rounded a bend in the trail and got a close-up, full frontal, eye-level view of my dad mid-piss. TLDR, a big group of hikers got an accidental dose of full frontal nudity by my dad taking a leak. My dad owns a body shop where he repairs cars. During the summers growing up and into college I would go home and help him to make some extra cash. I was taking the plastic off our aftermarket running board for a Jeep one day, and instead of cutting it off with a knife I had it bunched up into a band and was pulling the plastic in one direction and the running board in the other. When the plastic finally gave way my hand in the running board went flying toward a metal work table where it proceeded to smash the living hell out of my index fingernail. It immediately turned purple and was throbbing in pain. My dad looked at it and said it would feel a lot better if we relieved the pressure by penetrating the nail, to which I agreed. I didn't like the idea of drilling the fingernail with a drill in case it were to go through and drill into my hand, so my dad suggested heating a paper clip up with a blowtorch and burning through the nail until the pressure released. This seemed like a preferable idea to me, so I asked him to do it while I looked the other direction. I learned that day that my dad is totally grossed out by blood because he heated the paperclip, counted to 3, also looked the other direction, and burned through my fingernail and into the skin below it with a red hot paperclip. So while I'm howling, cursing, and now squeezing burned blood out from under my fingernail, he's struggling between gagging from disgust and laughing so hard he can hardly breath. That was the first hilarious memory from one of the best summers with my dad. For what it's worth, the paperclip idea works really well if you do it yourself and don't burn the skin underneath. A red hot paperclip will burn through a fingernail in a snap. My dad was a gardener from 1986 to 1998. The worst jobs were the first ones after a long winter. In 1992, or possibly 1994, but definitely not 1993, because my sister was born that year and he wouldn't have been working much around the time this happened. He started a 2 or 3 day job over on Cornhusk St. Cornhusk Street was frequently mistaken for Courthouse Street, and vice versa, because people down there used to talk really fast and many times it was hard to understand what they said. He was unloading his equipment and casually allowed a shovel to fall softly against the wall of an old shed on the property. As soon as that shovel hit the wall of the shed, billions, or possibly only dozens, of angry wasps came pouring out of a hole created by the shovel. My dad was stung literally tens of times, if not less than that. Luckily, he wasn't allergic to such things. However, he was pissed. With the stinger still hanging from his arm, he grabbed his gas can and started dousing that little shed. It wouldn't need much though, because it was old and dry, and that was a good thing, because he had only brought about 6 liters of fuel with him anyway. Much of his work was done with hand tools. Also, he wasn't making a ton of money off of this job anyway, so he was happy to only waste a small amount. It only took one match for that some beach to almost explode, backdraft style, and within 10 minutes that shed was history. He ended up telling old Mr. Brandt, the former owner of the shed, that it just spontaneously caught fire, and that dumb bastard actually believed it, and said he always expected it to happen, because of natural gas that sometimes seeped out of the ground or some other stupid shit like that. He even paid my dad another $10 for containing the fire, and not allowing it to consume his entire property, faking moron. So, in a way, those wasps and dumb as Mr. Brandt got served pretty well that day. Justice? As far as the wasps go, absolutely, although we are all reasonably sure that they didn't specifically have it out for my dad, and were merely acting to protect themselves as all animals do from time to time, except my uncle's old blue tick, who is as useless as a football bat, unless you got some food needs eating. For Mr. Brandt, I don't know. He died in '99, natural causes, without ever knowing what really happened to his old shed. Me and my dad kind of feel bad about that, but we figure he was probably a horrible person back in the day at some point, and he deserved a little bit of what happened, and really, all he lost was an old useless shed and $10. One time my dad decided it would be cool for us to go out and see nature a bit, since I was a little kid and that's meant to be fun. So we went for a camping trip, and of course, to prepare my little Canadian mind for the dangers of our environment as well as the dangers that we pose to our environment, he told me all the basic info. Don't litter, don't hurt the animals, if you see an animal don't approach, and most importantly, bears are just as afraid of you as you are of them. He ends his speech, and obviously him being the bravest and wisest man around, I take his word for everything. Then he goes on to show me the final lesson, after we've now had a look around the campsite, how to use the garbage cans, since they have special anti-bear handles. He walks up to the garbage bin, instructs that you are to push up with your fingers, then pull up, starts to lift the lid, and in the garbage can is a faking black bear cub. My little brain is terrified, because there's this gigantic super beast of evil, clearly not scared of us, and quite happy to point out anti-bear locks were a lie, and nothing is safe. Now, I don't want to die, so I start singing loudly, because that's how you're supposed to scare the bears when you're hiking. At the same time my dad tears off, picks me up like a football, runs like the hero he is, into a twig, which caught his foot, forced us both to face plant and ultimately present ourselves as the ideal meal for a hungry cub. But the bear was already gone and didn't give a shit. I then proceeded to cry, and my dad had taught me the ultimate secret, that he was a normal human, and also that bears are scary AF. TLDR, dad taught me about camping, proceeded to show how to open bear lock during the explanation, opened the garbage lid to reveal a bear, failed at rescuing me from an imagined threat, and lost god tier status. Smooth moves. So, Imation, dad's Chinese, which is why this story is relevant. In Chinese culture, preservation of wealth is a major thing. Chinese people love stability, and their personal finances are no exception, which has its ups and downs. As a result, you can imagine that retail sales are really popular in my family. Now, about the only thing that my dad spends money on without thought is his family. Thanks to him, I've never had to worry about money, and I count myself lucky that because of him, I'll graduate college with no student debt. Anyway, one Christmas, dad was in the mood to spend money on my mom, so he decided to enlist me and my sister in finding some jewelry for her. So, we go to Masses, or wherever, to find some nice jewelry. Lo and behold, he finds a string of natural pearls. For those who don't know, natural pearls are ridiculously expensive. Some strands have gone for $120,000 US. This strand that he found was priced at $300. So it's either fake or mispriced. Dad goes to the jeweler's counter and asks to take a look at it and have the jeweler look at it. Jeweler says it's 100% authentic. Dad buys the pearls, thinking Masses is nuts for selling the pearls at $300. One problem, Masses wasn't selling the pearls at $300. They were selling it at $3,000. Whoever wrote the tag on the pearls missed a zero. Dad goes to buy the thing, gets in a verbal fight with the cashier, and then the manager, for charging him $3,000 instead of the listed price on the tag. Eventually, they gave it to him for $300, at which point he says, adding insult to injury, I have a coupon for 15% off. The way the manager looked at him, if looks could kill. Anyway, my dad spent the next 3 months telling anyone who will listen how he paid $255 for a $3,000 string of pearls. My mom loved them, and still does. One time my dad was an inpatient in hospital, and decided to take his 4 bags which were currently connected to him, get in his car and drive home, so that he could set his skybox to record the football. Now you may be thinking, that foolish man, doesn't he know the risks of that? And he does. He's a doctor, a consultant in fact, also one whose job primarily involves the administration of things via needle. He's just faking crazy one time. Actually more than one time. My dad almost died in hospital and just didn't mention it to me and my sister until ages later as a joke. One time my dad had a colostomy bag fitted, which meant he wasn't supposed to do any heavy lifting. So naturally he moved a big old cart TV out of his room, down the stairs, and into the garage. This thing was so heavy he got me to help. One time my dad had been in a medically induced coma, but still had his breathing tube in, and insisted on being extubated early, so that he could tell a nurse off for making what he considered inappropriate comments about our own family. One time my dad had just got out of hospital and was put on a very strict diet plan because he had been nil by mouth for weeks and he's diabetic. So he decided fuck that and binged on sweets. This is still the same man from before who is a doctor. He ended up back in hospital in less than a week. One time my dad came out of a medically induced coma and within hours of being extubated was asking us to collect his laptop from home so he could do his taxes. My dad is crazy. One time my dad nearly caused an international incident in the Sinai Desert. He worked for a company in the 80s called XI, and they were contracted by the Egyptian government to find oil. My dad and a group of people were tasked to go out into the desert and look for oil wells. The way this was done was to drill a hole in the ground, lower some dynamite into the hole, detonate it at a safe distance, and use the sound waves to map what was underground. There were a lot of regulations on the team and all of the explosives were audited regularly. One day, a Canadian guy was in charge of auditing the explosives and he came to the conclusion that had 100 kgs too much dynamite. They couldn't just toss it because it could fall into the wrong hands, so they decided to have a bit of fun and blow something up. That something was an abandoned tank. This was shortly after the Israeli army withdrew from the region, so there were hundreds of abandoned tanks just rusting away. They decided to load up the surplus dynamite into the tank and wire it up. They retreated as far back as the detonator cord would allow. I think he said it was about 150 meters, and built a makeshift bunker to protect them. The detonator was wired up. They pushed the button and nothing happened as the cord was too long and there wasn't enough current to the detonator to cause the explosion. So the solution to this problem was to get a bunch of spare detonators, put them into a box and pack it with paper, and douse it with a bit of diesel. Light the box and run away. They piled into a truck and drove about a mile away, as they thought 150 meters wasn't far enough. Eventually the dynamite went off, and the explosion was so loud it was heard in both Cairo and Tel Aviv. Before they knew it, both armies had mobilized to see what had happened, and they were all promptly arrested by the Egyptian army. In the end the Canadian guy took all responsibility, and he was promptly deported. My dad and the rest of the team were allowed to stay, but they had their quota of explosives severely restricted. Also it turned out the Canadian guy faked up royally, and they were actually a 100 kgs under the limit and not over. TLDR. One time my dad and his team blew up an abandoned tank in the Sinai Desert. The explosion was so loud it was heard in Israel and Egypt and nearly caused an international incident. I just love these. One time my dad got 2 girls pregnant, my mom who was 14 and another girl, 19. My grandfather, his dad, made my dad marry the youngest, my mom. One time, my dad had his stepson, from his 3rd marriage, bring over a couple of pounds of marijuana from Mexico over the border to California. The stepson got busted, and my dad did nothing to help the kid out, despite it being his drugs. My dad also encouraged my stepbrother to regularly sleep with my sister. One time, my dad, along with his 3rd wife, stole my sister's identity and put her into thousands of dollars in debt. One time, my dad gave my boyfriend, we were 18, meth to give to me, and I'm like, nah, man, toad school. We often would smoke joints with him, so I think he thought it was the next evolution in drug use for me. Unfortunately, this drug was his and my mom, his first wife, specialty. I think they both did a lot of coke in the 80s, so speed was awesome. B/C it was cheaper and lasted longer. The sad thing is I can tell you exactly what my parents are on at any given time. I know their speed binges and their frantic erratic ad behavior, the alcohol and pills, and either being angry or just nodding out. The paraphernalia was always easy to find too. One time, my dad rapped his niece after he plowed her with drugs and alcohol. One time, my dad was helping this sweet old lady out repairing her electrical and whatnot. He told her he'd buy her house at 10%, and he brought her the paperwork to sign. She signed at 1%, thinking it was 10%, but she was old and could barely read. By the time her family got involved, my dad had the house, free and clear. One time, my dad used to trade speed to the addict across the street for 6, and then he would try to tell me about it. My dad is a type where he will say everything that pops into his head, regardless of whether or not it's appropriate. Me and my mum like to gossip about other people, and occasionally, my dad will overhear. One time, we were talking about an affair that a friend's wife was having, and my mum was trying to figure out the best way to broach the subject with the friend without sending him off the deep end. Next time we see the friend, my dad says, "Well, I'm sorry to hear about wife's affair. Will you be getting a divorce?" Friend's face dropped. End of that marriage. Friend got a tattoo I personally didn't like. He sees it and says that is a horrific tattoo, to which I responded, "You can't say that." He said, "Well, you think it's awful too." Awkward. At a parents' evening with my mum and dad. End of a meeting with my particularly attractive and recently scandalous teacher. He is asked if he has any questions. He replies, "I've been told not to talk. They're worried I'll bring up your affair." Very loudly, with the teacher she had an affair with at the next table over. One of my mum's friends brings over her recently adopted daughter to introduce her to other people. The daughter says something slang Y, like B or something. She was only about 6 or 7 at the time, and the friend laughs and says, "I don't like that word." My dad responds, "Oh smudge, it uses words I don't like all the time." "What's that particular word I don't like?" "Ah yes, beach." Family is mortified. Friend is shocked. Daughter asks what beach means. He doesn't mean it maliciously, I hope, but he has a massive case of not thinking before he speaks. Okay my dudes. I'm not too sure of when this was, I'd have to check with my but a few years ago we went to stay up with my dad and his wife for some sort of party. Could have been Christmas or an engagement or something, but anyway. We all get back to the house around maybe 2 in the morning and my dad just passes out on the sofa and me and my had a bed on the floor. Standard stuff so far, right? This is where it gets odd. Now obviously one of the worst feelings ever is waking up having found out you've pissed yourself. So try having your dad wake up, collapse at the foot of you and your girlfriend, and then piss all over them. He'd apparently woken up to go to the toilet, but passed out again on the floor and just pissed himself. I will always remember the look he gave me as he came around when I sat up, looking at me and my girlfriend, and then looking at the piss we were all covered in. After this, he got up and went to the cupboard for more sheets and then just chucked them over it and said it was all good now. TLDR, my dad pissed on me and my GF. One time my dad saved my life. Well, there's actually multiple instances of this. I'll name the 2 that I remember most clearly. The first, I was probably around 3-ish. One of my first memories. Dad and I were at Lake Powell in Utah/Arizona. We were on my dad's old 80-something Sea Swirl 19-foot boat. I was playing with one of his orange SOS flags, dragging it in the water, while the boat drifted along the lake in some canyon. Of course I had to lean over the edge, because I was small. Dad was fixing the radio. Sure enough, I fell in. I don't know how much time passed, but I'll say a minute or 2. I'm calling for my dad, scared as shit. Dad jumps in the water, not even bothering to take off his shoes, and swims probably about 300 yards out to me. The wind was carrying the boat pretty good, and he got me back on board. I was cold, so he rented a $200 hotel room that night. The second time, I was older. Maybe 10 or 11 I think. I don't remember where we were, but my dad had just bought the three of us, myself, my younger brother, and him, new dirt bikes. From Pep Boys. They weren't great, but didn't have to be. Mine was a Green Badger Motorsports 90cc 2-stroke. We were learning to ride. Well, we were at this campground somewhere in Utah. It had pretty decent trails, but not for really young beginners. There was a lake at the top of this mountain we wanted to ride up to. On the way up we got separated. My brother putted a long way up ahead, so my dad had me wait so he could go get him and took off. I waited probably 10 minutes, but my bike stalled during the wait. He got back to come check on me and restarted my bike. I got back on, and as I did, I gripped the throttle back by accident in first gear and lurched forward towards a sheer drop, probably 100 foot down. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to catch my handlebars just in time and swing me and the bike back towards the safe side. I really almost died that day. We never did make it to that lake. By that time I was terrified, and we just headed back down slowly. I'd be dead without my dad. That's for damn sure, as I'm almost positive there are plenty more times I'd have killed myself, if not for him watching out for me. Ah yes. I finally can contribute. Here we go. Obs. English isn't my mother language. Sorry if I use some weird or misplaced terms. My father is known by everyone in the family for always having belly aches and taking a dump whenever possible, all the faking time. This led to awesome stories starring him. One time I was returning home by bus with him. We got off the bus in downtown and started walking to the bus terminal to get another bus and get home. I was not surprised when he started rubbing his belly and making weird faces. Heeding the call of the sheet tsunami has been a thing for years, nothing out of the ordinary. On this moment he looked at me and said, "Here son, take this stuff and go home. I'll go to the nearest mall to take a sheet. Things are getting weird here, again." Expected from my dad. At that moment he just started to run in the middle of the street and just disappeared from my sight. I must add that the mall was not very close from where we were at the moment, but never mind that, I just went home. To my surprise my father was already home. I discovered that when I got in my bedroom, and he was proudly waving a skid-marked underwear at my mom and both were losing their shit laughing. Mom had a WWW face too. I asked what the hell was going on, and then he proudly told me how it went. Turns out he knew he wouldn't be able to make it in time for the mall, so he just entered a random snooker bar, trashy one, asked to use the bathroom, got in there, and had the horrible displeasure to see the in out of order stall and one urinal being used by a poor guy. Despair set in. He just asked the guy to do his thing fast, grabbed the handkerchief he always carry, got his pants down, turned his ass to the urinal, put the handkerchief just below the balls so the sheet wouldn't drip, and unleashed hell in the urinal. Someone entered while the deed was being done, gasped, blurted out some apologetic words, and got out of there straight to a therapist I think. The cons of sheeting inside a urinal is that there is no toilet paper, because as everyone knows, you are not supposed to sheet inside that. My dad is beyond these stupid social rules. So he just shoved the handkerchief between the butt cheeks and walked proudly out of the bathroom like nothing happened, hailed a cab and got in. Since he was really full of shit, he was sitting with one of the butt sides raised, like when you are going to pass some gas, know what I mean? He looked to the driver straight in the eye and said, "God, I have some serious pain in my leg right now." Yeah, dad, leg pains smell like death. Then he got home and was telling my mom his new adventure. After all that he asked what he should do with his underwear. My mom just shouted, "Throw that away or burn it." My dad looked at me and said, "See son, there is no love in his relationship anymore. She won't even clean my underwear," and started laughing like a madman. I love him. Had a feud with a neighbor. It began with the neighbor insisting that the road going by his house was off limits. This road was the shortest way from the main road to our house, 100 meters, the second shortest route being 3 times as long. Naturally, this meant that my dad didn't give a shit about what the neighbor said and used the short road anyway. I was fairly young at the time and don't know much about the legal stuff, but I don't think the neighbor had any power to restrict access. That didn't stop him from putting up signs and improvised wooden roadblocks, which my father removed whenever he drove by, only for the neighbor to put them back. My father used to drive a Toyota Land Cruiser, and he, my mother, brother and I were driving home. My father drove into the road and found it blocked once more. The roadblock was a wooden pallet with support sticks to keep it upright. My father then lined up the wheels of his truck to avoid the nails, then started accelerating towards the pallet. My mom started yelling, "What are you doing? Don't do it." But my brother and I shouted, "Do it. Do it," in unison, so my father didn't stop. He rammed the pallet at fairly low speed, tipping it over, then proceeded to drive over it, splintering the wood in a satisfying manner. The neighbor simply gave up after that. TLDR, Dad won a feud by ramming a wooden roadblock with his truck. One time my dad and I were catching a ride to the airport with his co-worker Lisa. She drove a minivan, and my dad was in the passenger seat. I was behind Lisa, and Lisa's toddler was behind my dad, next to the sliding door. We're in the left-hand lane of a busy 4-lane road, and Lisa has just finished telling us that she is extremely phobic of spiders. She had gone on about the topic for some time. I look up, and right next to her head is a gigantic spider, with an exceptional sense of comedic timing. The spider is along the edge of the driver's side window, so just behind her line of sight, but inches from her, and if she turns even a little she is going to flip the fuck out in this heavy high-speed traffic we are pinned in. I don't think I can coax the spider anywhere without drawing her attention to it, or risking it running towards the windshield. These thoughts all flash through my head quickly, and there's so little time to do something smart before she sees it on her own, so I think maybe my dad will know what to do. "Dad," I whisper. He glances over at me, and I point at the spider. "Jesus Christ, Lisa, there's a huge spider by your head." She sees it, screams, miraculously cuts through 2 lanes of oncoming traffic into an off-road, and if it wasn't there I think she would have just slammed us into a building, or jumped a curb, and she and my dad jettison the van. Dad opens the sliding door, and since in the last few seconds this freaked out spider has started crawling right at me, I launch myself over the crying toddler like a track star. We all end up shaken but fine. I realize my dad and I do not think the same, and Lisa forever gives me dirty looks at my dad's work BBQs for my apparent willingness to sacrifice her child to the spider gods. In my defense, the spider was coming right at me, but had a ways to go before getting to the toddler, so there was time. It wasn't a him or me situation. I have 2 decent stories. One time my dad got in a pretty bad accident which had him on pretty strong drugs. Occasionally he would need our help with certain things, and has since fully recovered. During this time he was at home and couldn't work, so he found things to do though. One of these things was melt some chocolate in a bowl, go into the bathroom and scream he needed help from my sister. I was involved in the joke and hiding, who came down, saw my dad on the toilet with what she thought was a sheet on his hands and legs and screams as he reaches for her for help. Absolutely hilarious IRL. The second story was in New York, where my dad had a few drinks and asked me if I thought we could get on the roof of the hotel. I was 9, so it sounded awesome. We get to the roof door and I say it looks like it has an alarm, and he says, "No, they just say that so you won't try and open it. Look, nothing attached to the handle for an alarm." It was a push door, and as he pushed it wee woo and me turning and jumping several flights of stairs back to our room, while my dad casually walks away. The best part is after dinner hotel security and staff approach my dad to tell him they have video evidence of me trying to get on the roof and I could be charged. Kicked out of the hotel? I don't remember, but it was serious. No video evidence of my father somehow is what it sounds like, so he proceeds to call them all liars and get into security's face about it. They called later to plead him to come down and see the video, and about the 5th call just called to apologize. Very interesting sequence of events for me who just followed the whole thing. The time my dad got roughed up by the Mexican drug cartel. This is the one story he refuses to tell me in completion. In college, both my parents worked at Little Caesars Pizza. They were pretty broke. Anyway, one day when my mom has a couple days off, my dad calls her up and asks her how much money she has. After learning she has about $1,000 in savings, he quickly declares that they ain't going to Mexico. They grab their passports and drive down over the next couple days. They decide to set up camp in the desert to keep the trip as cheap as possible. Now, for the first couple nights this is fine, but on the third night, they wake up to a truck full of Mexican dudes with guns. Luckily, my father is pretty fluent when it comes to speaking Spanish. They force them on the truck and take them back to a compound. They separate them. My dad goes out back with the coop dudes while my mom sits inside a shack. Now, my father won't tell me what happened back there, but my mom has told me this story a couple times. Apparently when he got back, he was pretty beat up. Bloodied face, bruised chest, the works. He tells my mom that they are getting their passports and wallets taken and are good to be dropped off in some random village. He hasn't ever told anybody what happened back there, but I can only assume some serious deal making happened. Thought dropped off, catch a ride with some bus driver that puttied them, and then got my grandma to pay for tickets back on an airplane. They didn't go back to Mexico for a while after that. One time my dad and his friends got into a VIP lounge for rugby players, referees and generally posh people by making up an entire backstory that flattered a retired referee. He knew the referee's name, so upon spotting him at the entrance to the lounge, he pointed and shouted, "Name, you bastard." Naturally, the ref was like, "Wait, are you talking to me?" So my dad continued, "You sent me off during the game against team back in '75, please." Note that my dad never really played rugby, he's just a big fan. So catching on to what he was doing, my dad's friends continued the story. "Yeah, I remember you now. Dad here was a bloody monster on the pitch. Loads of other players were scared of him. You gave him the ultimate Barlock King and sent him off. He never fouled again." So this went on for about 10 minutes, and the retired referee was getting super flattered over this story about talking down this bully of a rugby player that never actually existed. Eventually their story and flattery got them invited into the posh VIP lounge. Open bar, comfy seating, not too busy like everywhere else. My dad feels bad about lying to this referee because he was just such a lovely guy. He still MLs him now and again. But he's proud of making both a great night out as well as a brilliant story to tell. I've posted this before. It is the story of how I came to love watching football and why I will be a lifelong Buffalo Bills fan. It was a Sunday a long time ago. I don't remember if it was fall or winter, but it was definitely football season. My father was a huge football fan, which was a problem, because on this particular Sunday I really wanted to watch cartoons. I was probably around 6 or 7 at the time. "Daddy?" I asked, trying me best to sound sweet and cute. "What's up, kid?" asked Ratindad. "Can I watch cartoons?" Again, trying my best to be sweet and cute. I wouldn't learn until much later that this only worked on mom. "Nope, football game," he said, destroying my hopes. "But dad, football is boring. I hate it," I said. "Do you really think so?" he asked, actually looking a bit confused. "Yes, I would rather watch cartoons," I responded. And then he worked his dad magic. "Let's try something, pick a team." I don't remember who else was playing, but one team was wearing red, white, and blue, and to 6-year-old me, that was a sign. It was really only dumb luck that I picked a team that was based only 60 miles from my hometown. The ones dressed plain red, white and blue. I still didn't really understand what was going on. "Those guys are the Buffalo Bills, and if they win I'll give you $20. My mind was blown. This would have been the early 80s and $20 was more money than I had ever seen in my life. My tiny 6-year-old brain could barely comprehend how rich I was about to become. It was enough money to take over the world, or maybe buy a mountain made of candy. I suddenly needed to know everything about the game. Who are the guys in the stripes? What is a down? What does 3rd and 8 mean? What is holding? How do they score points? My father patiently answered question after question as the game wore on. As I started to understand the game, I also became fascinated by it. The Buffalo Bills won. My father gave me $20 and told me, "If they win again next week I'll give you another $20. It might have been the longest week of my life. But Sunday eventually came, the Bills won again, and a lifelong fan was made. I love to tell this story. I miss my father. One time my dad was washing my bedroom window, which was on the 2nd floor. He straddled the windowsill so he could reach the glass on the outside. As per usual, he would do this with no shirt, and it was the late 80s, so he was wearing short shorts. While he was doing this, the local fire department was on our block testing or playing with a fire hydrant and releasing water. After the firemen were done, they were backing the fire truck up down our street. It was a tight street with a dead end and cars would park along it all the way down. As it backed up, there were one or two guys signaling to the driver which way to turn the wheels. My dad from the second floor of our house yells down to one of them asking if they would like him to move his car. Our car was the last one on the end and would allow the opportunity for the fire truck to turn around if it was moved. Now this car was a 1969 Mustang Fastback. I don't know much about cars, but I did know my dad cherished this one. The fireman waved to him, gesturing it was fine. Well, don't you know, the fire truck backs into it. The truck pulls forward and rips the front end off. My dad was fuming, and he has a wee bit of temper. He ran out into the front yard and started cursing and stomping about in nothing but what most would consider swimwear. Oh, the neighbors were out. The police were called. Yeah, embarrassing to say the least. I remember going to school the next day and at lunch sitting there with my best friend, and we were unusually quiet all morning. He looks at me and said, "So I guess if your house catches fire you won't be calling the fire department." We laughed and that was it. I'd like to add my dad's a great man, served in the military for many years, humble and wouldn't hurt a fly. He never fought or assaulted the fireman, just yelled. The police were called by my dad. Thankfully they settled him down. He does not own that car anymore, but he still drives a Mustang. My dad has 3 sisters and 2 daughters, plus his father died young, so he grew up with many female role models. Dolls were serious business for him. Christmas Eve 1992, he was assembling a dollhouse for my sister, but he decided that he should also decorate it for her, assemble and put up the furniture, curtains, etc. Okay, sure, a toddler might find that more fun than assembling stuff herself. Now this brand of dollhouse sends everything to you in pieces that you snap together, so my parents had already spent hours connecting mattresses to bed frames and putting drawers in desks, etc. There's even flower boxes to which you can attach little 3-prong stems to which you can attach the provided flowers in red, white, or pink. My father decides that each window box needs 2 stems, each one with 1 red, 1 white, and 1 pink flower, you know, for symmetry. My mother, it seems, gave up on the project completely at that point. My dad stayed up all night to put symmetrical flowers in a dollhouse window box. Christmas morning, I was still learning to walk, so I immediately grabbed the roof of this house to pull myself up. The whole thing collapsed, and pieces flew everywhere. My dad stayed up another night to fix the flower boxes again. We loved that dollhouse until middle school. One time my dad decided to cut down a giant dead tree in our backyard for firewood, but also because the thing was black and shriveled and hideous and looked like the kinda dead tree that has a demon trapped inside it. The trick about cutting big trees while avoiding major accidents caused by a huge log falling down is to clamber up on it and cut it in sections with a chainsaw. Being one smart cookie, he tied himself with 2 different safety cables to avoid falling, you see. One an actual safety line attached to an actual safety harness tied to the dead tree in question. Another a rappel rope attached to a limb on another nearby tree a few feet away, 10 foot higher than the level he was, and about 3 stories from the ground. The other end was tied around his armpits and his back. Well, dad took all the safety precautions, but once he cut the first section of the dead tree, he also took out his first safety line. This caused him to fall, and, given he was still tied to the second line, which he had moments before proclaimed to be a genius level idea, dad proceeded to swing back and forth in the air, holding a live chainsaw, and yelling with all the might of his lungs a curious line in some weird foreign language he must have picked up somewhere, over and over again, which I quote, "Fuck piss fuck goddamn fuckers donkey moron fuck sake idiot god why mother faking." Fact sheet: it took us 1 hour to figure out how to get him down without cutting the line and having him crash to the hard-packed undergrowth below. Given that, for reasons of pride, the fireman couldn't be called, we eventually found a solution, delivered via a trampoline, clandestinely borrowed from our neighbor. One time my dad scared a mama bear so bad she left her cubs. We were camping way up along the maple syrup border and were literally 3 days away from food. When you camp out there you haul your food up in trees to keep it safe from bears. One climbed up around 3 AM and broke a 6-inch branch to get to our food. Dad heard the crash and ran in with a big stick. He yelled at the bear with the biggest war cry ever heard. It was later reported that Ollie Hermie actually shed a tear from 800 miles away. This is the only known time for him to do so. Look it up. True story. Anyway, the bear wasn't so impressed. She stood up on her back legs, looked down at my 6 feet 2 inches, 250-pound dad, and replied with her bear cry. Ollie Hermie was reported to have gone back to sleep knowing that I had been cast for my dad. But dad wasn't having none of that shit. He waved his stick in front of him and screamed with the same ferocity as the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs had as it crashed to Earth. The Grand Canyon formed, the Himalayas rise in abject fear, the fault lines in California creaked which later set up the 92 quake, and the last Tasmanian devil died in fear. The bear had had enough. She backed down and ran away. It was then that her 2 cubs came out of the bushes and ran after her, but not before stopping to bow to my father out of raw respect for the ferocity of his inner alpha male, the likes of which have not been seen since. Or at least that's what I was told. You see, I slept through all this and have to rely on the words of my father. Would you doubt a man like that? I certainly wouldn't. My father passed away recently, so this hits kind of close to home. My father was the toughest faking dude I've ever met and I'm ever gonna meet. He was a fisherman and a machinist for his entire life. One time, my father was on a 3-month tour on a ship and got a toothache. He wasn't even halfway through the trip. What are you to do when you're in the middle of the faking ocean? Obviously, you just go down into the engine room, find suitably sized pliers and remove the tooth yourself. One time, my father fell on board the ship he was working on and hurt his hip. About a week later, I joined him. I was 16, because they needed some help, and worked with him for about a week. I saw his hip had basically had like a baseball-sized contusion. He could barely walk and couldn't sleep on that side, but he just ate some over-the-counter painkillers and slept on the other side. A couple of years later, he was working in Africa and had to go to the hospital for some other stuff to be checked out, and they saw his hip. They wanted to x-ray it. Turns out he broke his faking hip and just ate some weak painkillers and worked like a madman regardless. Another time, he was working in Brazil. Being a sailor, he always had a pocket knife on him. He was ambushed by a group of young men that wanted to rob him. He fought them off and ended up stabbing one dude in the thigh, at which point they ran off. This is only really the tip of the iceberg. My father was a badass faking Viking. I'd say rest in peace, but if there is an afterlife, I'm pretty sure my dad is busy faking some dudes up in Valhalla. Dad and Mom, my sister lied to my parents and said she was sleeping at her friend's house, really going to her boyfriend's instead. In the morning she calls me, panicked as hell. Our car isn't outside. Her boyfriend at the time didn't live in a white picket fenced neighborhood, so it's absolutely possible that it could been stolen. She was asking if Mom and Dad found out and driven it home. I checked outside and saw nothing. She starts crying and eventually hangs up to call the cops and report it as stolen. About 20 minutes later the Milwaukee PD call our house. I didn't get the full story from them until later, but they explained to the police officers that they took the car and drove it to my grandparents' house, why it wasn't at home, to teach her a lesson and intern me, since I was a party to her attempted recovery. The officers played it straight and told my parents they completely understand. Very well then. We will handle it from here. And they continued the ruse with my sister, took all of the information and left. She didn't find out what was happening until my parents picked her up. I was certainly entertained and pleased to get sole car privileges though. TLDR, sister lied to my parents, snuck out to her BF's house. Parents went and picked up her car and left it at grandparents' house. She had to report it stolen. Parents told police everything and police continued the ruse. Grounded forever. The end. My dad and his brother were playing in the shed in the backyard. When they were about 12, one was outside throwing dirt clumps at the window, while the other was shooting back with a rare rifle, I think, and dad was shooting, and run out of pallets, and found nails that fit perfectly in the barrel. He proceeded to shoot my uncle in the head, and he had to go to hospital. Also my mum and dad used to drag race home from where they both used to work along the back roads. Mum had a Honda Prelude and dad had a bike of some sort. Can't remember what it was. When I was about 7 or 8 I went to a mate's birthday and we were playing indoor cricket, New Zealand woo, and my mate hit an absolute scorcher headed straight for my 2 to 3-year-old sister's head who he was carrying. His dad instinct kicked in, and he caught it inches from hitting her one-handed. My dad's a helicopter pilot and used to do tours out to one of the world's most active volcanoes. He used to do up to 5 2-hour trips a day during the summer, each with up to 3 people, sometimes more if they were using more than one helicopter. Anyway, on one trip one of the piston rings broke and went through the engine causing it to drop a piston and blow black smoke, this being over water too by the way. He was over halfway. He radioed that something was wrong and the ground crew asked if he could make it back to the airfield. He said no, and landed without a hitch on the volcano. He said it was probably one of the most scary experiences of his life. His boss gave him a Barlock King for not bringing it back to the airfield. He started looking for a new job and told him to get faked as he made the right call in the situation at hand and his boss didn't want to pay extra to ferry engineers out to the island. Last one for now. When I was 5 we went to the hot pools with some family friends and I stepped off the step in the pool and into the deep end and started drowning. He sprinted past the lifeguards and dove into the pool fully clothed and saved my life. From what happened is why I don't like water or swimming at all. Like if I was thrown into a pool I'd probably drown because I never learned to swim after what happened, even though I grew up about a 5-minute walk from the beach. I'm quite late, but I got a ton of these, all from the same dad. One time my dad decided, during a sleepover with my friends, that stabbing a screwdriver through the living room door a few times, blaming it on me the next morning, when my mother found out. One time my dad fell out of a loft hatch, snapping his wrist backwards. It folded back on itself, also knocking himself out in the process. He checked his ears for clear fluid. His whole process was to check for brain fluid, then ring an ambulance. One time my dad stuck his hand in a petrol lawnmower while it was running to clear the grass. Phoned an ambulance only when he couldn't reach his keys in his trousers right pocket with his left hand and couldn't drive home for a coffee before the hospital. They stitched his fingers back on. One time my dad fell out another loft hatch. One time my dad fell off a fridge. One time my dad got a rather large piece of timber stuck in his elbow and had to be cut out in hospital. One time my dad fell through a 2-tread stepladder breaking his shoulder. One time my dad fell off a stepladder painting a house. One time my dad fell off another stepladder putting his leg through a brand new oven door. One time my dad cut through a brand new oak kitchen cabinet door with a jigsaw. One time my dad beat someone's ass in a Hardee's parking lot in his pajamas on Christmas Eve. Backstory, this was around 2002 and my family drove a 2001 Chevy Impala for me, my 3 other siblings, and mom/dad. There's a very popular town on the outskirts of my city that is known for the decadent and downright outrageous Christmas lights in the city and on the houses. Southeast US if that's a hint to any of y'all. Anyways, all 6 of us go drive around these lights and decide it's milkshake time. Go to Hardee's, machine is down, whatever we leave. Well, some asshole took it upon himself to throw a rock at the car and tell my dad to slow down asshole. Well, my dad did not like that one goddamn bit. So he gets out of the car and this puny guy is still yelling something about slowing down asshole. Side note, my dad is 5'11", 250 pounds. Then at least, I've pissed the fuck off ex-paratrooper. Dude keeps yapping his knob polisher and my dad gives him the finger and walks away. Homeboy takes it upon himself to jump on my dad's back straight jungle style and this is where our Hardee's parking lot security guy faked up. The ass beating my dad laid down on this dude is still one of the worst I've ever seen. Meanwhile all 4 kids are sitting in pajamas in this cramped as Impala freaking the fuck out. After getting slammed a solid 4 times and taking blow after blow to the head, dude quits. Cops come. They ask my dad if he wants to press charges, and he looks at a D's task force man, looks back at the cops and just says nah. So, that's the story about my dad beating someone's ass wearing pajamas and flip-flops on Christmas Eve. One time my dad was over at the neighbor's place having a few beers and watching the football game or something. My mom and my sisters and I were heading over to a family friend's place to play like card games or board games or whatever. I was the last one to leave, so it was just me in the house. As I was getting ready, when I wasn't paying attention, Dad came home. I was just about to walk out the door when I saw him lying there, face down on the bathroom floor, groaning. It might help to describe my dad. He's the kind of guy who has his sheet together. Business owner, pretty well off, 3 kids, all spoiled. Human interaction may elude him somewhat, but you don't normally see him in compromising positions. This was a first for me. For a moment I thought he might really be critically ill, but I put 2 and 2 together pretty quickly. Still, you can't be too careful, so I approached and asked if he was okay. Yeah, I'm fine, he said, got to his feet and went outside. I gave him a minute. He might just want some fresh air. Then I followed him outside, not sure if I was going to leave or going to find him. And then I saw him lying there, face down on the front deck, groaning. Where he passes me, not sure what was wrong with him. They asked me if he was okay. I told them he was, though I wasn't particularly sure he was. I went over and sat down next to him quietly, just giving him some time to see if he did anything. He didn't, so I asked him nicely to go back inside. Yeah, alright. And away he went. At that point I figured he was on his way to bed, and if he decided to do anything else, that was his problem. Hopefully he lived. I went to the friend's place and told them all about it. They could hardly believe it. Dad did this? Remember, my sisters were there too. They were all exactly as concerned for his well-being as I was. More funny than worrisome. We kept it quiet. Didn't want to go out of our way to embarrass him. We went for a cookout by the beach the next day, and when Dad got out there he announced he didn't think he was gonna drink any beer for a while. On the inside, we were all killing ourselves laughing. Sorry if I wrote this story in a longer form than it was worth. I didn't expect it to come out quite that long. So, my family left for vacations, while I stayed back to take care of our little store 2 weeks with the house to myself, but due to the long work hours, almost nothing happened in the first week. Seeing the weekend as my only opportunity, I went to my favorite shitty bar and found jackpot with 3 bisexual girlfriends, one of them very drunk. We leave the bar, I'm driving. We are talking about stealing traffic cones and why every drunk does it, when all of a sudden, the drunk girl, who we all though was passed out, screams, "Stop the faking car now." I park it. She immediately opens the door and starts running away. At this point I'm completely pale, looking at the other 2, who appear to be chill with it. About 30 seconds later she comes back with a huge traffic cone, filled with concrete, which weighs about 40 kilograms. We put it in the trunk and move on. After hitting a 24-hour Walmart, and being the very same people we make fun of, we get to my house, unload the cone, unload the now actually passed out girl, put some plastic bags in the floor/couch in front of her in case she throws up, gets drunk with the 2 other girls, 3 sometime faking awesome at least for me, drive them home in the morning. No evidence is left. A few days later, my parents get home. They've received a warning from the condo management of loud noises coming from the house. Just loud talking and laughing, I assume. I'm not that good in the weekend and that disturbed the neighbors. When they get back, my dad sees the footage from the cameras and hides it from my mother, who would freak out if she knew what I did. She's very overprotective. He waits for her to leave and high-fives me, tells me how faking proud he is, and then he grounds me for a month. He also lies to my mom, telling her that I had a couple friends home for some BBQ in the weekend. My dad has done a bunch of stuff, some of it kinda dumb, some of it heroic, all of it badass. Using a previously discarded sawzall, reciprocating saw, pulverized the end of his left thumb. Had to slowly drill a hole in his thumbnail to relieve the blood pressure, creating a fountain of blood that stained the drop ceiling in his office. He had thrown the saw away because it had become unsafe and was a pinch hazard. Climbing down a tall extension ladder with a drill in his hand, with a very large paddle bit in place, barbeled the drill for a second, which made it swivel in his hand and point the sharp tip of the bit right into his chest. As he tried to push the drill away, he was pressing the trigger, which was slowly winding his shirt into the drill bit and starting to create a puncture in his chest. Heaved the drill away, showed up at home with the entire chest of his shirt missing. Driving down the highway in the winter, saw the car ahead of him catch on the bank of snow, careen into the median, and roll several times. During the first roll, the driver was ejected, and the car landed squarely on the guy's chest and legs, with its roof. Luckily the 12 inches of snow kept the car from crushing the guy, but the driver was in shock, and was quickly becoming unresponsive and cold. My dad and another bystander managed to lift the car enough for the guy to wriggle out to safety, where they found that he only was wearing underwear. Never got an explanation on that one. There's a whole mess of other awesome stuff, most of which are the tear-jerking, good-natured stuff. My dad is one of the most caring people I've ever known, and I'd love to share some of those stories, but I'm at work and I'd rather not have to explain that I'm crying because I'm telling strangers about how awesome my dad is. Those stories are for another thread. Now, my father is 5'8". He's a soft-spoken, unassuming man with an affable face. I was about 6 to 8, and we were walking back to the car from a grocery store, and two cars halfway down the aisle were backing out, relatively quickly, and, unknowingly, in the direct path of each other. This quiet man, who never raised his voice even when yelling, all of a sudden let out the loudest, most ear-piercing whistle you have ever heard. Everyone in that car lot heard it. It was loud enough that both drivers, despite having rolled up windows, slammed on their brakes instantly, inches away from each other. They looked around, realized what was happening, and my dad raised his hand in brief wave and we continued on. And that was when I discovered my dad had a superpower. I don't get to see it much. I've probably heard him whistle like that all of 3 times. Years later my niece was learning how to whistle and told me I probably have the loudest whistle of anyone ever. I laughed and told her to tell grandpa. Next time we were all together she's showing off, and I tell him that she suspects no one can whistle louder. My dad smiles at her and gives one brief blast and hero worship alighted in her eyes too. I've spent my whole life trying to whistle like that, and I'm no slouch. I can change the tone and volume of my whistle. I can whistle just as well breathing in as breathing out. I can put my tongue under my teeth and whistle without any need of puckering, but I just can't get anywhere close to his. When I was 7, I decided to stay up and see for myself if Santa was real. I set out cookies and milk, then grabbed a blanket, a flashlight and a camera, and camped out behind our couch. At first, my parents thought this was cute. I was not a very sneaky stakeout specialist. I hummed and then outright sang Christmas songs from my hidden position. But eventually, it got late and my parents were tired and ready to go to sleep. So my dad had a great idea. At about 11 p.m., he rushed into the living room. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, Dad?" "I heard something outside. There's something on the roof." I lost my sheet. This was my moment. I was going to catch Santa in the act. Prove to that asshole Josh that Santa was real and Echo would give me a kiss for helping her believe in Santa once again. My dad, however, had other plans. "I think it's a robber, here to steal our presents." And in a moment, I went from excited to terrified. A robber? Oh no. We lived in the country. The police would never get there in time. We'd lose all of our toys. Mom's new pots and pans Dad got her, though she wouldn't have minded that. Dad is bad at Christmas gifts. The pocket watch we bought Dad. It would be awful. But never fear, my father had a shotgun. And he'd take care of that robber. He grabbed a handful of shells and stuffed them in his robe and ran out the door loading his Remington 1100 Express 12 gauge shotgun. I ran to my mother. I had to keep her and my little sister safe. My mom was asleep, so was my sister. But they wouldn't be for long. From outside we hear, "Hey you, stop, get away from my chimney or I'll shoot." Then the thunderous peal of a shotgun firing. I screamed. My little sister kept sleeping, and my mom shouted, "P-33J's Dad, what the hell?" My dad walks into the house, He has Santa's hat in his hand, his shotgun in the other hand. His eyes were wide in disbelief. I shot Santa. No. I was in tears. My father had killed a 1600-year-old mythological creature who bent the laws of time and space with nothing more than some overgrown deer and a wheel-less wagon. My dad let me sob for a few minutes and then said, "I didn't shoot anyone, but I will, if you don't go to bed." The next morning there were presents under the tree and cotton on the plate with milk and cookies. From Santa's beard, you know. Oh my god, there are so many, so I'll go with the most recent. One time my dad literally scared the piss out of a home invader. I had moved out by this time, so I will be retelling the story as I've heard it from my mom's, dad's, and little sister's perspective. One summer night about 3 years ago now, my dad was sitting in the living room playing with his guitar. You see, he's mellowed out quite a bit over the years, and is now teaching himself guitar. Anyway, the sun is not quite down yet, but my dad notices flashlights around the front and side of the house, so he runs outside and sees several police searching the neighborhood. They live on a dead-end street in a pretty closed-off neighborhood. There's plenty of streets, but only 2 outlets. So the police tell my father that they made a traffic stop in the main road and the guy bolted and ran this way. Well, it gets dark and they aren't finding him, so they call off the search, and my dad goes back inside to continue playing his guitar. Now a few hours later, my dad is still in his chair in the living room. My sister is in the kitchen cooking herself something, and my mother goes out to the laundry room to do laundry. Now the laundry room is a tiny doored-off room on our back porch which connects to the kitchen. As soon as my mom opens the laundry room door, some guy stands up and lurks towards her, and she just goes oh and runs back into the kitchen. And this guy follows her, I guess trying to explain himself. But at this time my sister turns around, sees this, and yells into my dad that I think that guy the cops were after is in our kitchen. Now my dad have a very distinct snap to attention, where he almost looks like that caveman SpongeBob meme. So I imagine he snapped up from his chair and bolted to the kitchen, where he immediately starts berating the guy in his typical Marine Corps drill instructor fashion, calling out orders on the ground. Face on the ground. Where are your hands? Don't look at me. At this point my mom and sister are afraid that my dad may kill this man, so they turn their complete attention away from the intruder and trying to push my dad out of the kitchen. The man collapses in the fetal position in the corner and pees himself. All this time my dad is now yelling at everyone. He's yelling at my mom and sister to go into the other room. He's yelling whatever he can think of at this guy. The guy begging for my dad to let him leave, but that's not happening. So finally the police show up, and my dad lifts this guy up and says one of my favorite lines I've ever heard. Pointing to my mom and sister, he says, "If those two weren't here, you'd be picking pieces of my kitchen out of your teeth." And then tossed him to the cops and went back to playing guitar while my sister mopped the floor.